Katati sound test, 1, 2, 3.
Mike. Good evening, fellow council members.
Good evening.
We just got new earbuds, whatever the heck they're called, because the other ones I had did not connect with my laptop. So this allows me to be on a bigger screen, so it's much easier to navigate. I'm sure I'll mess up somehow.
Hello. Good evening, Mr. Mayor.
Good evening. Are you back in the neighborhood?
I am back in the neighborhood.
You're not sitting out in front of City Hall with Councilmember Ford?
I am not.
Although it's a pretty nice evening for it, really.
It is. I don't know if I'm going to be ready to go back to work and have to wear pants come fall versus shorts. Are you guys available for the Kids Day?
I am now that I'm back.
Are you remaining mute on that, Vice Mayor then?
Well, I have my own thoughts about given the constantly changing development where we seem to be at vis-a-vis health, about actually even having a Kids Day right now. So I'm still kind of working that over in my mind, frankly.
I know. Do you think we'd be at a better point by now?
Well, several weeks ago, I would have bet hard money on it. Good thing I'm not a betting man. But it'll come. We're a better place now than we were a year ago. That much is certainly a given, and I'm grateful for it.
Good evening, Councilmember Sparks.
Hello, nice to see you.
Likewise.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Hello.
Hi, Damien.
Hello.
I don't know. It seems to me 6 o'clock comes pretty early.
But it's worth it at the other side of the night.
Damien, have you heard from Ben?
No, I have not.
Oh, there we go. Good evening, Councilmember Ford.
Good evening, Mayor Moore.
Gee, not in front of City Hall tonight, huh?
Not yet.
I counted on you to stand guard.
Hey there.
Oh, there you go. Now I feel better.
Can't leave the place unprotected.
That's correct. It's your job.
Well, I've got 6 o'clock and it looks like everybody's here, so we'll go ahead and start our meeting. Welcome everybody to the joint meeting of the Cotati State Council and the successor agency to the former Cotati Community Redevelopment Agency for Tuesday, August 10th, 2021. Ms. Burgess, if you could kind enough to do a roll call.
Councilmember Harvey.
Yes, here.
Councilmember Sparks.
Here.
Councilmember Ford.
Here.
Vice Mayor Landman.
Here.
Mayor Moore.
Here, thank you very much. And Mr. Orbit, if you would be kind enough, I've been a little remiss in the last couple of meetings in introducing our staff that we have here.
Sure. Yeah. So we have myself, Damien, obviously City Manager, Damien Ovid, City Manager. We have John Bacher, our City Attorney here. We have Angela Corder, our Administrative Services Director. Noah Hausch, our Community Development Director. Michael Parrish, our Police Chief. Craig Scott, our Public Works Director and City Engineer. And then also tonight with us we have Joel Galbraith, who is our one of our senior planners. And I believe that is it for tonight.
Thank you very much. And then if you would all join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. So at this point, we'll look for a motion on the approval of the minutes.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. So we have a motion and a second. And Ms. Burgess, if you could kindly give us another roll call.
Councilmember Harvey.
Yes.
Councilmember Sparks.
Yes.
Councilmember Ford.
Yes.
Vice Mayor Landman.
Yes. Oh, actually, I will abstain because I wasn't here at this last meeting. And I did review it, but since I wasn't here and we have a comfortable margin, I'll abstain. Excuse me.
Noted, thank you. And Mayor Moore.
Yes. Thank you, Ms. Burgess. And now we will move on to announcements. To the meeting orientation for new attendees and viewers. In conformance with the Filed Act and the adopted City Council rules, the meeting agenda includes items labeled as action items where the City Council will consider the item and citizens are afforded the opportunity to provide comments relevant to the item being discussed. The meeting agenda also includes a citizens business item, which is the designated place on the agenda where citizens have the right to say whatever they wish. The City Council may or may not choose to respond to comments as the government code allows. However, if the City Council declines to respond, it should not be perceived as giving credence to or agreeing with any statements that City Council or its members believe are incorrect, misinformed, or purposefully biased. Measure S supports police services, a variety of recreation programs for all ages, and the maintenance of our streets, parks, and public buildings. See details on the web at cotati.org. Citizens interested in receiving City of Cotati community alerts via text or email are encouraged to sign up at nixle.com or by texting your zip code to 888-777. And like always, we hope to hear from you, so please feel free to contact the city at 707-792-4600 or info@cotati.org. If you have a non-emergency issue after normal business hours, you can contact us at 707-792-4611 And of course, if you have an emergency, please contact 911. Continue to look for updates on the city's website and social media channels available on Facebook, Instagram, Mixel, and Nextdoor. Do we have a approval of the final agenda? Any changes, Mr. Obid?
No, thank you, Mayor. Members of the council, no proposed changes tonight.
Thank you very much. And at this point, we will open it up for citizens' business. Ms. Bridges?
Thank you, Mayor Moore. It appears we have no attendees at this time.
Now we'll move on to the consent calendar. Unless there are any items on that consent calendar that wish to be pulled by the council, I would entertain a motion.
Move to approve the consent calendar.
I'll second that.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. Ms. Burgess, roll call, please.
Councilmember Harvey.
Yes.
Councilmember Sparks.
Yes.
Councilmember Ford.
Yes.
Vice Mayor Landman.
Yes.
Mayor Moore.
Yes, thank you very much. Now we move on to direction on future agenda items. Are there any interest in future agenda items from the existing council? Councilmember Sparks.
Yes, thank you. I would like the city council to consider a COVID vaccine mandate for city employees. This is something the County Department of Health has asked employers to do, and I think we ought to follow that request and have a discussion about it as soon as possible.
Thank you, Councilmember Sparks. It's funny, I just had that conversation with our city manager yesterday.
Oh, I'm sorry, I also had one other item as well.
Oh, okay.
I've received some constituent complaints about leaf blowers in the morning, and I would like to consider revisiting our noise ordinance and just taking a look at the noise ordinance to see if we can modernize it and update it to be more effective for dealing with some of these noise complaints.
Thank you. Certainly not fun at 7 in the morning. Councilmember Harvey.
Yes. The Groundwater Sustainability Agency is getting close to having their plan ready, and they are preparing a presentation that is available for councils, and I think that it would be worthwhile for us to get that presentation when it's ready, when it can be scheduled.
I think that would be great. Do you have an idea when they're looking at presenting that?
I can work with Damien to get that schedule finalized for that, but probably, in the next month or so.
I would imagine on an issue like that, sooner is better than later.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And then I want to float the idea of supporting the Roanoke Park City Council on the banning of fireworks, and maybe sending a letter of support in that direction if the council is interested in entertaining that. I think droughts and noise and safety, things like that, they could use some support. I believe it's measure D. I could be wrong. And I don't think we have anything else at the moment. That should give you enough things to work on, Mr. O'Good.
Yes, got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now we'll move on to public hearings. And this is an introduction of an ordinance to amend the land use code to establish multifamily objective design standards.
Thank you, Mayor Moore. As mentioned, this item is to present an ordinance for the City Council to review the city's objective design standards, and Senior Planner Joel Galbraith will be the lead staff on it. However, I just want to provide a brief introduction, kind of as to how we got here, to lay a little bit of a foundation, and then Joel's going to get into the specifics on the ordinance and the design standards themselves. And so in 2017, a law called SB 35 was passed by the state legislature and signed by the governor. This created a by right process for certain multifamily housing projects in cities which are seen as not meeting their current RENA allocation as determined by the state. The state has published, I think it's a 36-page summary of how you implement and how they would make that determination. but a quick summary is essentially they would divide your allocation into eighths because it's an 8-year housing element cycle. Katati got 137 units in our last housing element, spread across a variety of income categories. So then you would divide 137 units by 8 years, and that's about 17 units per year that we're supposed to build. We're in the 6th cycle or 6th year of that cycle. So just to make it easy, you would multiply that by 6 years. We're supposed to have built 102 units. To date, we've built 100. To get into this a little bit further, they also parse it by the income category. So we have housing in very low income, moderate income, and then market rate. The state process further parses it by that. So if a project say we weren't meeting our very low income allocation, which we are not, this project coming in to build very low income units could take advantage of the SB 35 by right process, even if we were up to date on our market rate projects, for example. Just to give you a brief summary, by right means there is no discretionary process, so there's no public hearings, there's no process by which the Planning Commission or the City Council would affect these projects, and there's no CEQA review. There are some carve-outs for sites that are deemed to have, environmentally sensitive habitat. So some of our CTS habitat and wetland habitat sites would not be able to take advantage of SB 35 process. But separate from these kind of individual mechanics of SB 35, as a staff person, we see it's very important to put these design standards in place because regardless of the specifics of SB 35, the state has essentially telegraphed their intention to keep pushing jurisdictions into allowing certain types of projects as by right. And the only way that we would be able to affect the design of these is to have these established objective standards, which essentially will create a checklist by which a developer could say, yes, I meet it, or no, I do not. Very clearly, staff could then apply that checklist as we review a project that's going through a by right process, whether it's SB 35 or some future process, and then they would get a building permit. So I just wanted to kind of lay the groundwork to identify kind of how we got here and point out that this idea is not coming from staff. We are reacting to some laws that were passed by the state, and we are recommending that the city get some objective standards in place while we have an opportunity, because we have not had anyone approach us on an SB 35 project. However, the majority of those projects have been in the peninsula and in San Francisco, closer jurisdictions themselves. However, we have seen SB 35 projects proposed in Petaluma and in Santa Rosa recently, and most recently in Sebastopol. So developers are becoming more sophisticated, more understanding of these processes. And if we want to be able to affect these designs in keeping with the designs that we have or the expectations the community has, we need to get some standards in place in order to do so. And just one more point, the law seems to be marching in the same direction with regards to telecommunication facilities. And so I asked Senior Planner Galbraith to make some general design criteria as a part of this process as well, to get that established in case we have some cell tower companies, cellular companies, telecommunication companies showing up proposing some 5G small cell infrastructure in our community as well. So just know that's the reason for being here. We did some surveys from the community to inform our proposed design. We went through the Planning Commission 3 times. And all the result of all that work, 2 surveys has led to the document that's before the community and the council this evening. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Mr. Galbraith, and I'm happy to chime in and answer any questions along the way. And Joel, he may punt to me on some questions, and I'm going to maybe lean on him and others as he's been lead, but I've been kind of doing the background policy stuff, as you guys have known. We've been talking about housing issues and these things coming.
Thank you, Director Hausch. Next slide, please. Mayor, Moore, and council members, I'll go over the background of some more background. Noah gave most of it, but in 2018, SB 35 went into effect, and that streamlines eligible multifamily projects. And so I'll go over briefly what eligible means under state law. So eligible by the state means it's multifamily and it meets minimum and maximum density plus any applicable density bonus. It must include affordable units. It's urban infill, which means 75% of the site adjoins developed parcels. It's already zoned or planned for residential uses. There's notification of Native American tribes. And under the state, each unit only needs one parking space per unit. And if within a half mile of public transit, no parking is required. Next slide, please. Regarding location, as Noah mentioned, if it cannot be used in an environmentally sensitive area and it cannot remove existing tenant occupied housing. And number 8, typically the projects do not involve a subdivision of land. And also there's provisions for prevailing wage and a skilled workforce. And the last thing on the list, which we'll be going over today, are the objective standards. So to use the SB 35 provisions for by right housing, it must meet the city's objective standards. And so what's before you today are just the design standards. So the city already has objective standards for everything else regarding setbacks and such. So what we're adding to those objective standards that we already have are the design standards. Next slide, please. The use of what some people call as the fast lane process, this is an opt-in process. So it can only be used by the developers that choose to use the process and meet all of the adopted state and city standards. Once the developer demonstrates that all the state and eligibility criteria and city objective standards have been met, then only a building permit is required. What are the benefits of this process? This process provides clarity for residential developers and applicants, and it provides more certainty for project approval. Next slide, please. We'll go over more of the background. So this did go before the Planning Commission as a workshop on March 15th of this year. Staff presented the results of the visual preference survey, which was prepared by staff. Staff presented draft multifamily objective design standards. Staff also presented draft telecommunication design guidelines. And at the workshop, in general, the Planning Commission was concerned that the objective standards were not strict enough and did not require a specific architectural style. Next slide, please. And on the Planning Commission conducted a second workshop on May 3rd of this year. And at that workshop, staff presented revised draft objective design standards requiring the use of craftsman style design elements. Staff also presented possible locations where objective standards could be used. Staff discussed the need to revise the open space standards to be more flexible to recognize the needs of different housing types and populations. Next slide, please. This is an overview of the design standards. They are proposed to be adopted by ordinance and would be included in the Cotati's zoning ordinance. They would be applicable to new qualifying multifamily projects proposed within Cotati. And these standards are shaped by Cotati's zoning ordinance, the general plan, existing guidelines, and input from residents and local design and planning firm and city staff. Next slide, please. Cotati must provide a by right residential development option. However, the applicants can request different standards. If they do so, then they must go through the Cotati's typical discretionary design review process. Next slide, please. This list of some of the challenges with the process. It does reduce decision maker discretion. There typically is no public input on development projects that meet all objective design and development standards. And the standards that are adopted must be realistic, acceptable, effective, and fair. Next slide, please. I'm going to go over the proposed amendments. As I stated previously, this is a ministerial by right review process that the applicant may choose. If the developer applies for the ministerial review process, the project must comply with all state and CATADI objective design and development standards. Next slide. So the way the review process would work, as staff anticipates it, the applicant requests streamlined processing and submits plans and a checklist. So the checklist would show how they are complying with all the standards of the city and the state. Staff would review the plans submitted to verify the proposed project complies with all the state and city objective standards within a certain time limit. If it meets all the standards, staff would approve the project without a public hearing. At that point, the applicant may then apply for a building permit. And generally, the public notification would be on the city's website, and a notice of the project approval would be sent to the surrounding neighborhood. Next slide, please. I'm going to go over a summary of the proposed design standards that are in the ordinance that's before you tonight. The first category is neighborhood compatibility. It would require the buildings to be oriented to the street. Street-facing parking is not permitted. Visible roofs must be sloped with a low to moderate pitch. And if there's a third story, it would need to be 30 feet setback from adjacent single-family properties. Next slide, please. This is regarding building design. Craftsman style is required. Four-sided architecture is required. Units facing the street would require to include front entry porches. Next slide, please. This is also regarding building design. Eaves are required with a minimum width of 18 inches. Exposed roof beams and or roof rafters are required. Windows shall include divided lights, surrounds, double hung, single hung, or fixed. Next slide, please. This is also regarding building design. Entry doors shall include recessed panels and or glazing with a wood surround. Exterior materials shall consist of a minimum of the two of the following: solid or concrete-based wood siding, solid wood or concrete-based shingle siding, stucco, brick, stone. Materials such as T111 siding, particle board, vinyl, and EIFS are prohibited. Next slide, please. This is also regarding building design. Blank walls, which is the walls with no doors or windows, shall be limited to 20 feet in length and shall include art or be screened with landscaping. Next slide, please. This category is massing and articulation. To reduce the massing, the project needs to include features such as balconies, bay windows, and individualized entries. There's a requirement that buildings offsets be included with a minimum offset of 18 inches, and that would need to occur every 50 feet. And the 50 feet is a typical width of a lot. So that's trying to create the building, strike at the mass of the building so it resembles more attached housing with a 50-foot width. And also the roof lines also need to articulate vertically every 50 feet. Next slide, please. This category is open space and landscaping. And what is proposed is the use of usable open space, not just open space, but it needs to be usable. And so each unit is required to include a total of 150 square feet of usable open space. That's for the entire project, 150 square feet per unit. And if the site's adjacent to a public park, it only needs 48 square feet of open space on the project site. And the way the ordinance is currently written, adjacent means directly adjacent to it or directly across a local street. So if the park's located across a collector street or a major arterial, it would not be included. So it needs to be directly adjacent or directly across a local street to be counted as open space. So there's two types of open space. Generally, there's private open space and there's common open space. So the private open space would include a private entry porch, or it could include a private patio garden. So if it's a ground floor unit, it needs to include one of those two. So typically if it's facing a street, it would need to be a porch. The units that are not facing a street, they could be a porch or it could be a patio. In projects, the upper story units, this is not required, but the developer could propose private balconies as usable open space. And there's also, projects need to provide common open space, and there's various options. One is a courtyard, another one is a burnout. Rooftop deck is one. So projects that have more than 10 units need to propose one of these types of common open spaces. Also, projects that include 10 or more units or more than 10 units also need to include three additional open space types. So let's say you have at a project there, if they were doing a courtyard, they would also need to provide three more open space types, such as a playground, community center, community garden, or a burnout. So the way the ordinance is written, it not just requires so much open space, it requires a variety of open space types to be included within the project. Next slide, please. So I'll quickly go over the open space types that we just talked about. These are photos of the open space types that would be included. One is a courtyard, common courtyard. The next one to the right is a burnout, which is a shared driveway that's equally shared with pedestrians and cyclists, and includes pavers and the lack of curbs and adjacent landscaping and seating. So this is intended to be used as a shared space. The next category down to the left is a community garden. The next one to the right is a bocce ball court. So any type of a play court, sports court would be included as usable open space. Next slide, please. And this on the upper left shows a rooftop terrace that would be included as open space. To the right of that is a playground, and also indoor spaces that are for the community that can be social or for recreation that can be included as open space, such as the two photographs on the bottom show like a community lounge and a fitness center. Next slide, please. And this shows a private balcony would be private open space, and to the right of that are private outdoor patios, and the last one at the bottom is a front porch, and that could also be included as private open space. Next slide, please. So part of the proposal too is also to change a section of the existing code regarding multiple family open space, and this is what's currently in the code. And staff has found this to be unusable, and there's parts of it that are left blank regarding private open space, and so staff's proposal is to replace what's existing in the code for multifamily housing that's used basically citywide with the proposed standards that are being proposed today for the objective design standards. So basically it would be the same standards, whether you're going through the discretionary review process or through the by right housing process, you'd have the same open space standards. So that's what's being proposed at this time. Next slide, please. And some of the additional amendments that are before you regarding, these are the more, I would call them more minor categories, but outdoor lighting is required along walkways and driveways. regarding site design, streets that are shown on adopted plans would be required to be extended. Dwellings would need to overlook open space. Garages and carports shall include architectural elements of the main buildings. Parking shall be screened. And the project must preserve and restore historic buildings as part of the project. Next slide, please. These are more categories. One is accessory elements. Roof equipment and trash would need to be screened. Dumpsters would need to be provided for projects of 5 or more units. Outdoor storage would need to be included for each unit, and laundry facilities would need to be provided within each unit. And if it's a mixed-use project, there would need to be pedestrian connections between all uses within the project. Next slide, please. I'll move on to the telecommunication and small cell design guidelines. So these are not standards, these are guidelines which are indicating the city's preferences. And this would apply to telecommunication facilities that are on public or private property. And these are the larger antennas for communications. And the intent is to minimize the visual impacts of these facilities consistent with state and federal law. And these projects may be located on private property, public property, or located within the public right-of-way. The ones typically located within the public right-of-way are the small cells that are becoming popular as we go to 5G technology. Next slide, please. These are the proposed guidelines regarding facilities on private and public property. These do not include the public right-of-way, but on private and public property, they need to be located to minimize impact of scenic qualities. The facility should blend into the surrounding environment by integrating into common site features. So on the photos to the right, that's a case where the antennas have been blended into to common site features, such as artwork and steeples and such. Also screen with vegetation is an option. If there's any kind of enclosure for equipment, it should be architecturally integrated with the surrounding buildings. Next slide, please. We'll move on to the small cell design guidelines, and these are relatively new facilities, and they're popping up in the larger cities first, such as Santa Rosa. And these are basically are more smaller facilities generally spread out through the community, and they're generally to increase the, I guess you would call data reception as we go into 5G technology. And many of these are located on wooden PG&E poles. So the examples you see to the right are wooden PG&E poles. And under state law, the city has no discretion over these installations on the PG&E poles. They are not city-owned poles. However, these would be the city's preferences on how the city would like to see these facilities. So they should not be located directly in front of a residence or other habitable building. They should be located more than 50 feet from a street corner. They should be screened with vegetation. Equipment should be neutral in color or match the color of the pole. So in these examples to the right, you see some of the newer facilities that went up where there were a lot of neighborhood complaints. This example is in Santa Rosa where the equipment was placed in front of the sidewalk. It was not painted to match the color of the pole. An example to the right shows a similar PG&E pole where the equipment is generally, there's an effort to have the color match the pole so it's not as visible. Next slide, please. Also, these communication facilities can be located on city-owned poles, and typically these poles that are owned by the city in their right-of-way would be a metal street light or a metal traffic signal. These are are typically where you would see them on city facilities. The city needs to allow for these types of facilities, but we can have design standards. So the antenna and equipment should be flush with the pole and incorporate a stealth design. Next slide, please. And if there is ground-mounted equipment, it should be located behind the sidewalk, screen, or undergrounded. And also, this was one of the major talking points at the Planning Commission was the public art. And their hope was that when there are these types of boxes in the public right-of-way, that the owner of the box would participate in that public art projects that could be sponsored by the city or other jurisdictions. Next slide, please. And this is a revision that staff is asking be included in this amendment, and it's a minor revision, but this is regarding applicability of the design standards. And what's being added is what's in red, and that's regarding the provisions of this chapter apply to all residential projects which demonstrate eligibility pursuant to California Senate Bill 35 or similar state or city legislation as may be amended. So we're proposing to add city to maybe in the future the city may be also adding provisions for by right housing that go beyond what's proposed by state law. And in that case, these standards going before you today will also apply to those projects. Next slide, please. And this is the final slide, and it is recommended that the City Council conduct a public hearing and introduce an ordinance as revised, amending the land use code to adopt multifamily objective design standards, amend the open space standards for multifamily housing projects, and adopt a resolution establishing telecommunication and small cell design guidelines. Next slide. And that concludes staff's presentation. Are there any questions at this time?
I'm sure there will be. Thank you, Mr. Galbraith, for that and the work put in on that. Thank you, Mr. Hausch, for that. With that, I will open it up to the City Council. It looks like Council Member 4. Go ahead.
Thanks. A couple of questions. So first on roof pitch, there was one standard that visible roofs have low to moderate pitch. And another one that roofs be vertically articulated every 50 feet. So the first one doesn't apply to invisible roofs, right? So if there's a flat roof that you can't see from the ground, then that obviously is not low to moderate pitch. But the second one doesn't seem to have an exclusion for invisible roofs, and I'm not sure if it makes sense to require invisible roofs to have vertical displacement versus the fronting that would create the same effect, the displacement in the faces. So I'm just curious about whether it's the intent that the vertical displacement requirement apply to invisible roofs as well. Second was about the requirement for laundry within units, and I'm wondering why that requirement that can work contrary to some efficiency and climate change goals that we've got, where shared laundry can be much more efficient. And then the third was about the Woonurfs, or however you pronounce that Dutch word, about these, which I'm curious how how carefully they're defined in the ordinance, because as I look at them online, they really, to me, look like a way to count your parking lot as open space, and I'm not in favor of that. So if there's careful design standards for a Woonurf that we can point to, that's great. But if it's just a way to say we put a basketball hoop in the parking lot and now that's our open space, then I have trouble with that. And in particular, I want to make sure that the parking spaces for the vehicles themselves do not count towards the open space requirement. Thanks.
So the question regarding the invisible roofs and then having to articulate vertically, the intent was no, they would not have to do that. If they're not visible, they're not to articulate vertically. Regarding the laundry, that obviously is not, I would say, a design standard. It's more of a livability standard. And so that's something, if the city council wanted to change, that would be an easy change. But that was the thought behind having in-your unit. It makes that unit more livable when your laundry is right there. And regarding the burn-off, in the ordinance there are some standards in there. Probably the biggest one is that it would need to be some type of paver. It could not be just concrete or asphalt. It had to be some kind of individual paver, which could be clay or concrete, but it's an individual paver. It has flush curves, so there's not a raised curb. And the landscaping and seating needs to be right along the burn-off. It would not include the parking. So if the council would want more specific standards, which you may want, then that's probably something we could look at some more and add some more specific design standards for that. But there are some design standards in there, so it's not just putting a basketball hoop in the parking lot. But that's something that we could add some more if you would like.
Thanks.
Councilmember Harvey.
Yes, I agree with Councilmember Ford. I'm a little bit concerned about this Warner, yeah, however it is that you say it. Because what occurs to me is that would be really changing from an asphalt driveway to just putting pavers and then calling it open space, when in reality, it's really looks and feels and acts like a driveway. And the fact that it has different kind of stones on it does not really make it be available for folks to use. I can't see, like a play structure on it so that kids could play. You mentioned that bicycles could ride on it. Well, bicycles can ride on, asphalt driveways too. So that one concerned me a little bit. I am, having been on the council for quite some time at this point, one of the handful of things that we get many, many people coming out for is any kind of developments that happen. People's lives are busy, and it seems like we only get a lot of input when there's something, going on, being built next to someone. So, and we get a lot of feedback, believe me, and a lot of, threats of, eliminating us from councils and all those kinds of things. What are we going to do to all of a sudden let people know that we are not allowing, or the state is not allowing them to have any public input? Because that seems so against, this movement towards transparent government. If all of a sudden, a housing development pops up next to you and you had no input on it. So that really concerns me, because as I said, I've been here long enough to see the mobs of people that come in when a housing development is going in somewhere. The other thing that concerned me is the way it was worded about, well, you can't do it if it's tenant occupied. Well, it doesn't take very much for someone to go buy a house and then all of a sudden the tenant has to leave because the house is sold. So that seemed a little bit weak in that. And I don't know that there's anything that we can do about that, but I can see developers going in and, buying houses and tearing them down to do these things. And I'm wondering about the environmentally sensitive areas. And I'm trying to think kind of ahead with the properties that we have that are undeveloped, that are developable. And it seems to me that most of the properties that we have within our city have some form of environmental sensitivities. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. For instance, there's a property that I had, I was not aware was a tiger salamander one because it's on a hill, so it didn't really make sense to me, but I was told that it was. And then lastly, on the small cells, in the examples that you gave there, you show what we're asking for and the streamlining of them. But what you don't show in the picture is what other equipment that goes with it. So in the example where you cross it out and say no, you have the big refrigerator on the ground and then the antennas on top. And it implies in your other picture that there is no refrigerator that goes with those things on the pole. And I was wondering if we could insist that any of the refrigerators be underground then rather than above ground. They're really very obtrusive, and a lot of them are in walking ways on sidewalks, and they are just a magnet for graffiti. So if the refrigerator things have to be there, I do like the concept of having art on them that would hopefully help with some of the graffiti. It's just like right now we have a whole bunch of them in downtown where one of the groups that had those black and yellow stickers and they pasted them all over every box that was downtown. And I know staff tried to get them off, and whatever material they used to make them, they do not come off. So that's even almost worse than graffiti. At least most of the graffiti, they're able to wash off. So those are kind of my questions at this point.
The first question was regarding public input. I'm not sure, was the question regarding public input of the whole process or just for the individual projects?
So this ordinance says that by right they can do this, and we don't get to ask. We don't have to have a public hearing. So my question is, do we have a plan to let the community know that this has changed and there will not be any public input on these? Because when you say that, well, once it's approved, we'll send a notice, I believe you said, to the surrounding owners. I don't want 100 phone calls because I didn't let someone know that they could not put any input in on something when I didn't really have a choice to let them have input, if you get what I'm saying.
So Councilmember Harvey, I'll take this one. So we absolutely recognize this challenge, and anytime there's a lack of process where the expectations are that there should be a process, it's going to be concerning and it's going to be troublesome to the community. As someone who has to manage this process, we struggle with, okay, is it more helpful to let someone know that there's something coming that they have no ability to chime in on, or tell them after the fact, like on an individual project notification basis? So is it better to say, hey, there's a project that's been applied for that you can't affect through your process? Or is it better to say, hey, this was approved and it will be coming? So we can write the regulations to where we notice them ahead of time or after. I generally think it's a better thing to do after. But to answer your question specifically, it is our goal as we roll out the housing element process to highlight that part of the need to make changes through this housing element is reacting to changes in the state law. And I'm sure you all will recognize that we have been beating this drum since we held the first housing workshop in 2019, saying these things are coming, these laws have changed. But to your point, there's not been a great way to do a mass notification to the community that says, hey, certain projects are now allowed to go straight to building permits and you will not get a chance to participate. We're happy to take any input the council wants to give us. And also we definitely plan to do kind of a community-wide outreach campaign to let folks know not only all the things that have occurred, but the things that we're going to be doing, again, as a part of the housing element process. We are looking to hire a community engagement specialist with a specific individualized contract as a part of the housing element update process that will focus just on engagement.
I think that will be helpful, because otherwise what will happen is not only will you get calls, we're going to get more than calls, we're going to get recalls. Because if you get a whole group in a neighborhood that all of a sudden thinks that we did something, you know, in a room somewhere when it was out of our control, I think that's unfortunate that we have to deal with these laws. So I think the more, as you say, communication that we can do up front, I think the better off it is for the community, so that they're not surprised. It's the no surprises thing.
And I'm sorry, I also want to add, we are building a housing specific website, and my goal will try to have it be as clear and as concise as possible on the surface, so people can get a broad understanding very quickly, and then allow them to drill down into more of the specifics on individual topics they're interested in.
Okay.
The next question, Councilmember Harvey, had to do with the tenants on the property versus ownership. So if the property that somebody wants to do one of these projects, if the project has tenants on it or has had tenants in the last 10 years, they are not eligible to use this process. So if there's a property that was zoned properly for multifamily, you'd have to have a house on it that was occupied by the owner. Then my understanding is they could use the process. But probably if you're thinking about somebody would buy a bunch of single family homes, demolish them to build a multifamily project, I'm thinking that those homes would not have the appropriate zoning for multifamily. So the case where somebody might be using this would be a case where it's a large piece of property zoned for multifamily, but has a existing owner-occupied house on it. And actually those are pretty rare. Typically these large pieces of property might have a few small homes on it that are rented. So I'm not anticipating that's going to be a major issue with this.
Okay. And what did you say about the 10 years they couldn't have had?
Under the law, basically the way the law is written, that they don't want the developers to get a fast track process where their project's demolishing rental housing.
Right. Yeah.
And also too, they don't want developers coming in demolishing housing so they can get the fast tracking. So if there's been rental housing on that property in the last 10 years, they're still not eligible.
Okay, that's good, because that wasn't highlighted anywhere, so that's good to know.
Regarding the environmental sensitive sites, so basically the western 2/3 of Katati, which is CTS habitat, critical habitat zone, they would not be eligible to use this process. So
Okay.
those kinds of sites would not be eligible. If they've got wetlands, habitat that's critical, these are documented habitat sites, they would not be able to use this process.
Okay.
The last question regarding the small cells, and can all the cabinets be undergrounded? I don't have an exact answer to that. I'm not an expert on the cabinets. I have a feeling the answer is probably no, that they cannot all be undergrounded, but I would have to do more research on that and get back to you on that question.
Yeah. Because what's really irritating about all of this is they talk about it, oh, well, they're just these little small things we're going to put on the telephone pole. And they neglect to tell you that, oh, by the way, we're going to put this side-by-side, sub-zero refrigerator on the ground next to the pole. That, by the way, you're going to walk in and have to walk around and all the rest of that. So that would be my preference. Yes.
Mr. Mayor, just a quick comment on that. In my experience, the cabinets on the ground have gotten a lot smaller over the years. I've been working with these companies on small cells. So it's less of an issue than it was before, but you were, for a while there, you were getting the gigantic cabinets on the ground. PG&E has allowed meters on the poles now that are a lot smaller. So things have improved, and the companies don't like all the effort they have to go through to get these things approved. But all the effort we've gone through has improved the system and the equipment that shows up on these poles. So hopefully they don't preempt everything to such an extent that we have basically no control. But I feel like local governments have done a good job of making the industry improve and improve the looks of the built environment. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed.
Thank you for that. I could just only hope that the technology will get better and the cabinets will get smaller. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Lemon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, before I go into my comments, I will just agree with that undergrounding if we can. I'm pleased to see that things have improved and that local government has done what it should. It should work for local control that works for communities, and glad to see that. But if we can push for undergrounding, since these are smaller, it's easier to do. I think that's a great idea from Councilmember Harvey. First, I really have to say how much I appreciate the work staff, as well as the Planning Commission, put in trying to make this meet as best as we can, given the circumstances, the expectations that the community clearly has. And I think it's a good thing we do our best tonight, and as we work on this, to get the best result possible, because when they become aware of what's going on, we'll have to be able to show them that we've tried to meet their interests, which we know very clearly. So with that, I've got a few questions. I'll try and go through them. I did winnow out some earlier today with staff, but unfortunately I still have a bit to work through. So first of all, multi-story. One thing that is clear from hearing the public, and the survey made this very clear, people living in Cotati really don't like the idea of stacking above 2 stories. They just don't care for that. Now, of course, we have to allow greater than 2 stories in some of our specific plan areas, the downtown, Santero. But for regular infill in less dense neighborhoods that aren't part of a specific plan, can we have a requirement? Is there any reason we can't have a requirement that doesn't allow greater than 2 stories? And I like to do these questions one way I want to get an answer if I could. It's too much for you to do all at the end, if that's okay with staff.
Okay. What we would have to do, we would have to look at the specific zoning district. So if the zoning district now allows, let's say it allows 3-story, that's an existing standard. If somebody came in to use these objective design standards, we would have to allow that to be 3 stories if the zoning allows it.
Yes. But if it doesn't currently, and I believe most of our areas, I suspect, don't, and again, I'm thinking mostly infill here, Joel, not our larger areas, the few larger areas we might have to be developed. I believe it's important to define, open the doors you want to open and close the doors that you don't want open now, because otherwise we'll get results we don't like. And I could see, as some of my colleagues have said, somebody wanting to come in and knock a house down in a residential neighbor and put up a 3 or 4-story structure. And that isn't something that we would normally allow. And so I just wanted to ask, is there any reason we can't require that in those areas?
I believe we need to do a little bit more research. I don't have an answer tonight, but I think we need to do some research on our code and also with other state laws regarding.
I think it would be important to do that, Joel. These are the expectations the community has. Some of these things we've agreed to, such as the downtown, almost 2 decades ago now, maybe at least 15 years. But for these areas, their expectation is it remains a small town. And if we sit here and don't even bother to research our ability to restrict what they would feel, I believe, is overly large growth in residential neighborhoods, it's infill, I don't think we'd have done right by them personally. So I would like to see that come back. And along those general lines, I noticed on one of the packet pages, I think it's 129, it talks about requirements for a 30-foot setback if you're putting a 3-story multifamily, a new 3-story multifamily building next to an existing single-family home. First of all, I appreciate staff looking out for situations like that, because I think that is problematic. But I wonder, that's still, even though that's by planning standards, a generous 30 feet, for people living there, that's nothing. And I look at Olaf Street and I see what was done there in the late 50s or early 60s, and I'd like to avoid that. I wonder if we could instead feather these infill developments, essentially by size in the smaller infill areas. And I'll give a couple of quick examples of what I'm thinking. First of all, if you're building a new multifamily next to an existing single-story, single-family and residential neighborhood, it doesn't go any higher than 2 stories, 1 story above its neighbor. If you're building next to a 2-story, if the zoning allows it, you could go up to 3. If you have a circumstance where you have a large lot that might be developed into a very big multifamily complex, and it does happen to be abutting on one side a single family house and neighborhood, I would expect it to feather so that the units on that side would match, then step up, and then finally step to their final size. Is this something we could do? And I should explain to the public, I'm sure my colleagues know, but we have a street in town called Olaf. It's an older street, mostly very small, charming bungalows, but at one point in time, somebody put in some very large 2-story concrete apartment complexes without any sort of feathering and stepping up to it. No duplexes to quadplexes to apartment complex, but just right in there. And I think I've always looked at that as an example of poor planning, poor zoning, and I'd like to see us be able to avoid it. So is that something that we might be able to do with this, Mr. Galbraith?
I agree. We need a little bit more, I would say, research and study to come up with some standards that would work. So yeah, I would say, look at that, probably come back with something that would work. Yes. Good,
thank you. Now the biggest challenge, trying to pronounce this, Vunurfs or Vernufs. I think it's tomato, but I'll go with Vernuf for now. I first saw that in the packet and I thought it was a misprint, and then I looked it up and I found it's actually a real thing. So I've learned something new this week. I appreciate that. I too share my colleagues' concern. The first thing I thought is, I like the idea of it. I love the one picture example you have. I know that this can work for communities in some ways, but I also see it as the cheap way out for a developer. Let's face it. If you have a list of things that you can use for required private and public open space, and it involves building parks, small parklets, or adding balconies or porches, or you could just use the existing street you have in the back and put some cobblestones off and call it a Vernuf and put a sign up and maybe a shrub or two. They're going to go that route. I honestly feel, and what I want to ask is, I don't think we should have Vernuf as something that can be used for meeting your numbers. I think it should be removed from that. I think instead what we should do, and the reason I say this is I have some concerns about some of the footage that we've allotted, the 150 square feet, as well as especially the 48 square feet for areas next to parks. I personally feel that's a little small. I'd like to push for that to be bigger, to provide more for these neighborhoods. But I see a different way to go here, maybe with the Vernufs. And what I'd suggest is we don't allow them to be used as part of the calculation, but we require them. I'll ask my colleagues and the public to think of the nice little development we did recently by 21st Century Health here in Cotati. The units face the street. Then in back is where the roads and the approaches are. There's a nice central green area, a little walking path around it. It's really a nice design. And as I looked at this, I thought, wow, if we built that road to Vernuf standards, removed the curbs, used the cobblestones, labeled it as for people to use, put in a few trees and benches, we'd have something that wouldn't cost the developer a lot because they're already putting in a street. And we'd really add something to housing that is often struggling to be as comfortable as the others who are able to afford single family or larger. I think it would just be a huge benefit. So that's the suggestion I have in that. And I'm asked the question for you, is there any problem or precedent, or am I missing anything in terms of developer cost in that? I mean, I know there should some changing to cobblestones and stuff, but I don't think it's excessive as some other things might be.
Yeah, we have not specifically looked at that question on the cost, because the way it's been proposed, it would be an option the developer could choose. But as far as requiring it, I don't know how much more cost that would be. So that was something we would need to look at. It's also a standard that other projects may not have to meet it unless they're using these standards. So we need to kind of look, I guess, at a fairness of that. If someone's using these standards to get more affordable housing, but they're getting this extra cost that the developers are not having to do.
This might be something we might want to do with most of our neighborhoods now that come before us, whether they're coming through just straight through like this, or whether we still have discretionary review over them. Because I think what you've hit upon, the name may be difficult, but the idea is great. I just don't think it works, though. I agree with my colleagues. I don't want it on the list of being able to be used because I think it's a cheat, kind of. So enough on that. If we're looking at some other items and this needs to come back, I wonder if we could look at that and see if something like that could be workable. Because for me, that would settle the question of going back and forth and increasing the space, and particularly with those houses that only have 48 square feet, those projects. Let's see. So I think I got just about there. Rooftop terraces was mentioned as something that can be in the list for private or public open space. And I really like that idea. I think those could be very nice spaces for people, whether they're private individual ones or even perhaps something public or larger. But I only had a couple of concerns. One is in the documentation here tonight, Joel, it only said the only requirement is a table and a couple of chairs. I think that's a little too minimal to turn this into truly usable and enjoyable public open space. I wonder if we could have a general requirement for trees and shrubs of varying sizes. I'm not talking huge. I'm talking from small to no taller than perhaps we are, in containers with a drip irrigation system put in place. This makes this a desirable space in a relatively cost-effective way and gives some privacy. And particularly if you have a public area that's shared, it's important to do this because it's much harder to do it that way. And lastly, speaking of these, when we look to if we wind up in a situation where we have a publicly shared, so a large rooftop area on a larger development that's going to propose as being used as a terrace, I think we should have some general requirement, at least that in design, that the architect look to minimize noise for the units that live below that space. Now, for individual terraces above individual units, I don't think that's necessary. You control your own noise, it'll be fine. But if we do wind up in that situation, so if we just, without getting too prescriptive, if we had something like that, I think it would be valuable to protect an unforeseen and unpleasant circumstance for people living on that top floor. So let's see. And the last thing, the very last, just something came up in your comments. Indoor space being used as part of the open space calculation. Seems illogical. I have some concerns about that. Does this mean, again, it's a lot like the Vernus? Can a developer say, oh, here's a little lobby that serves a mail room or this or that? I'm using this as part of my open space. If we have a collective laundry room, is that part of the open space? I'd really much rather have open space actually be open space. And although I'm not a big champion of density at all costs, I will say that by having everything we do inside, any open space we use inside in meeting rooms or this or that, that is in the lost housing indoors too. So I think it works in both directions to have that space outside. Just a thought, if it stays and if my colleagues like it, that's fine, but I would like to see a slightly better definition of what counts and the value it brings to the people living there, so we don't have, worst case scenario, somebody taking advantage and counting space that probably really doesn't bring much value.
So regarding the rooftop terraces, I think those are easy changes we can easily make. Adding the landscaping and specifying noise requirements, some of those things we already have in our code regarding decibels for inside noise, so we can add more on that. Those are easy changes. Regarding the indoor space, in the way the code is proposed, it has definitions of what that means. So office areas that are not recreation, like a laundry room and things like that, are not counted. So just to clarify those things are not counted unless it's recreation, leisure, or social. That's what's counted for the indoor space.
Okay, well, I have some openness to going either way. I'd be curious what my colleagues feel about that. My first meeting to try and maximize private open space for people to have a private place, as well as a nice public green area for all these developments. But I see the value in what you're proposing as well. So we'll see where that goes. I think that's all the questions I had for now. Thank you. I would have liked to have seen this gone forward tonight, but I think I'd rather see it come back with answers to these questions, because some of them, particularly questions about how many stories we would require in some of our neighborhoods, I think we need to do full diligence on so the public has satisfaction. We've done the best we can in this somewhat difficult situation for us. So thank you for your time on that. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Councilmember Sparks.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. My first one is regarding outdoor lighting. The way that this is worded right now, I have a few concerns about, since we won't have any review over these projects, that this could lead to increased light pollution and sky glare. One of the great things about Cotati right now is we actually have a pretty good dark skies. And I don't know, some of you know, but my day job, I'm an astronomy teacher, so I'm very sensitive to our ability to enjoy the night sky. And if we have several by right projects coming in and adding a lot of outdoor lighting, it's really important for us to get this right, since we won't have any review of it. So I'm wondering, my question is, would there be any difficulty in adding a provision in the outdoor lighting section that lights should be fully shielded such that no light escapes upward above a 90-degree angle? Because there are provisions in here about not trespassing onto other residences and properties, but I wondered if that would be a problem, or could we do that easily?
That would be an easy change to make, yes.
Okay, great. And one other thing about the lighting was the LED energy efficient LEDs. The way we have it worded, they would have to choose the most energy efficient available. There's a trade-off there in terms of light pollution, because generally the most energy efficient LEDs contain a great deal of blue wavelengths of light, and blue light is the most damaging in terms of light pollution and obscuring the, well, the sky is blue, right? So the sky scatters blue light very effectively. So it interferes with your darkness of the night sky more than quote unquote warm colors of light, red and orange. So I would personally be inclined to take out the most energy efficient wording and say something about as energy efficient as possible, with a preference towards warm lighting and less blue colors. So I'm wondering if that, same question, is that something that would be easy to do, or do you see any reason that would be a problem?
I'm not seeing a reason for a problem. I will do some more research. I'm not an expert on that topic, but I will do some research and see what we can come up with. But okay. I think it's resolvable.
Okay, great. And then one more question I had was about SB 35 and one of the slides you had early on. There were a couple of provisions. I think it was on the slide where you listed challenges relating to this. That the objective standards needed to be reasonable and acceptable. Can you just give me a little more background on who it needs to be reasonable and acceptable to? That seemed a little bit vague.
I think more doable, like to the community and to the developers, something that can actually be done.
Okay.
It's realistic. It's something that it's not, I would say, pie in the sky, something that is not realistic. We're putting in standards that nobody can meet. So right. The goal is to have these standards that are real standards that acceptable to the community, but they're also they're achievable.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Ford, did you have a clarifying question? Or
yeah, I'm sorry. One more question that I forgot to ask before. So it's about the trigger for being sort of subject to SB 35 requirements. When I looked at the documents I could find online, we're in a particular category where currently projects that, if I read it right, projects that are at least 50% affordable can take advantage of this by right process. Is that, and then there's another category of jurisdictions that are projects that are at least 10% affordable can take advantage of it. But we're in a, like, because we've met most of our categories, it's only very low that we're severely deficient in. It's got to be 50% affordable or greater to trigger the by right. Is that right?
I don't have an exact. Noah, do you know the answer to that one?
Yeah, so I would say it's a snapshot in time.
Sure.
So the issue is, if a project is coming in right now, then they may be subject to some category. But if we get into January 1st and we're in a different year, our numbers change. And so I don't think it's worth getting kind of bogged down into individual metrics of when it'll apply or not, because December 31st and January 1st could be different buckets of compliance. And then, as I mentioned in the beginning, new legislation has essentially been promised by certain individuals in the state legislature to allow more housing by right. And so getting these in place now will allow us to at least put our stamp of design on how those projects are implemented within the community.
Okay. So the general principle that if we actually meet our arena targets through discretionary projects, then people can't do a by right project. I mean, that's the SB 35 rule anyway, right?
That is correct. Under SB 35, if we are meeting our arena targets, then that is not an available pathway.
Thanks.
And Vice Mayor Lemon, you had a clarifying question or an additional question?
Apologies, I did not lower my hand. I'll do that right now.
Okay. And then I had a couple of questions. I like that Councilmember Sparks brought up the lighting issue. I have a concern with that. And then looking at the standards, realistic, objective, fair, and acceptable. Who's defining that?
That would be the council.
And
I would say, unless challenged, and then it would likely be this Department of Housing and Community Development at the state.
okay, so if we did something, they could come in and say, well, that's not fair. I'm like, well, what is fair? So that'll be interesting. Okay. Well, hopefully we meet our arena numbers and we don't have to worry about this. In reference to the apartment complex on Olaf that Vice Mayor Lemon brought up, I wonder if that wasn't constructed prior to our incorporation in 1963, where it was under the county, unincorporated. Because it certainly doesn't look like it fit in there, and of course that was at the beginning of Sin on the State. Yeah, notifications. I am more inclined to follow the advice of Mr. Hausch, because if it does fall within the by right and the SB 35, I think notifying them after the permits have been approved satisfies those requirements. It wouldn't be pleasant. It wouldn't be the most fun meetings to have, but I think if you stir it up beforehand when they can't do anything about it, it's just poking the hornet's nest. To use that term. And I would concur with Vice Mayor Lemon regarding the indoor-outdoor. Indoor hardly seems to be open space. Maybe a rec room for a portion of it, but a little weight room and a lobby and things like that certainly does not seem to be open space to me. And then finally, in these design standards, do we have any ability to say we want all these developments to be solar, 100% solar?
I do not know the answer to that question. I would need to do some research on that one.
Yeah. Because if it is part of a design, then certainly that would be something that would be much more environmentally promising.
Mr. Mayor, I don't see why you couldn't adopt a general policy that would require solar on all projects. And if it was a general standard like that, I don't think SB 35 would override that requirement.
Okay, so that may be next. That might be a future agenda item on there. Okay, so it looks like we have a lot of questions that have gone to planning and community development. I will now open it up for public comment. I'm sorry, Councilmember Harvey, did you have another question or a clarifying question?
Not a question, just to follow up on your comment. It was not my intention on the individual projects to have people notified in advance. It was in general that this thing that we're doing is coming down the line. And as Noah said, in the housing element, they're going to kind of stress that. I was not implying that we should let people know beforehand that they had no say in an individual project. More in general, this is what we're doing with this ordinance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so with that, we will open it up for public comment and see if we have any citizens to comment.
Thank you, Mayor Moore. Looking to our attendees tonight, if you'll use your raise hand icon. Mayor Moore, that will end public comment.
Thank you, Ms. Burgess. So we have no public comment on that. We have some suggestions that it appears that community development and planning have gotten a lot of information that they're going to bring back.
Correct.
Okay. Do Councilmember Sparks?
Thank you. I just wondered, I had withheld everything I wanted to say until now because I was just asking questions before. So is this the appropriate time to have a council discussion about?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I wanted to respond to Vice Mayor Landman's question about the indoor open space. Personally, I think I would be okay with a fitness center or a common room that could be rented out for events or things like that. But I also am concerned about, I don't want a lobby. It's like a little tiny lobby to be counted as open space. So if there was a way to define that a little more clearly, that it would truly be I think it is defined as recreational space, but maybe putting a little more oomph to what a common room or rec room should look like. I would be okay with that. That was one thing. Another thing was I feel like I want to push back just a little bit on the resistance to 3 stories. We're in such a dire housing crisis right now that if we limit the number of stories, that could potentially make a project not pencil out and not get built. And then that would be a major loss for our ability to meet our RHNA targets. So just want to push back a little bit on that, although I do understand and agree with the concerns. Just that the other priorities that we have of building more housing might outweigh that for me in some situations. And then last but not least, I was reading through some of the comments that we got from the developer that this was sent out to, and they seem to take issue with a lot of parts of it, not possible or practical requirement for multifamily development in about 20 different places. So my question is, can anyone on staff maybe give some background on your opinion of those comments? Do you think that those are reasonable or unreasonable? And would developers find since we only got feedback from one, as far as I can tell, one of the people we sent it out to, in general, would developers find these guidelines to be reasonable and acceptable? I was just a little concerned by the huge amount of yellow highlighting there was on that document.
So to answer the question, a lot of the projects that were in the visual survey comply with a lot of the guidelines. So like not having parking in front of the building facing the street. So that's one of the guidelines, but the commenter said that wasn't practical. So we've got projects built in the county and in Cotati that meet a lot of these guidelines, but the one developer is saying they're not practical. So they may have a different preference, but some of these guidelines are similar throughout other jurisdictions in California. So other developers are doing these types of projects. So they may not prefer that guideline, but it doesn't mean it's not doable. That's how I was reading a lot of the comments that I saw.
Yeah, and I would just add on that, one of the things I really appreciate about Senior Planner Gaba's approach is every single photograph in the survey were Sonoma County developments that are built. And so a developer was able to make those projects pencil and get them built. And we just really wanted to hear from the community, from this menu of projects that our development community is used to building or has demonstrated that they're buildable. Which ones do you prefer from a design standpoint? And that was very intentional on Joel's part, and I really appreciated that because it demonstrated that they are buildable. And just one other thing I wanted to stress is that the city has a contract with a local architecture firm, and they, as a part of our design review administration process, they're called Articulation, and they primarily work for developers. So they are a developer, oriented architecture firm that does a lot of projects that get built. And we engaged with them and got their direct feedback on these guidelines in 2 different sessions. And so while they did highlight that some of these things are adding costs to projects, we did also listen to their input and make compromises. And that's where you see some of the things that only ground floor units require the porch or the balcony, and the upper floor units are able to provide that open space through a variety of other types. And that was intentional because waterproofing a balcony on every second and third story unit is an additional cost. And that articulation or attaching those balcony units do add cost and complexity to construction. And so just while I think it was kind of more of a reactionary comment letter, I will say we tried to be thoughtful in what we came up with and how we kind of parsed these guidelines and requirements to thread a difficult needle to meet the expectations and get quality design, but also be thoughtful where we could to try to allow them to save some costs.
Thank you for that. I had one follow-up question about some of those comments that seemed a little maybe less reactionary. There was just one comment about an exception for tinted windows for Title 24, which I have learned is related to energy efficiency of the units. So I wondered if that was something we might consider, the ability to tint the windows to reduce the heating and cooling costs, or cooling costs, I guess. Did you have any thoughts about that?
I think the issue that comes up is if it's reflective windows is more the issue on the appearance of if you're trying to get a certain residential feel, you don't want a window that looks commercial or industrial if it's reflective. So we can look at that some more. I think the idea is to get something that looks residential and not industrial or commercial.
That makes sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councilmember Ford.
Yeah, thank you. I was not terribly concerned about the comments from the developer. Lots of unsupported, not possible or practical comments, so it didn't worry me too much. I wanted to talk about the indoor space issue counting towards open space. I could go either way on that. I know some condo developments in town that have a common building that is opened once a year for the HOA members meeting, and otherwise it just sits there and collects dust. And so I'm concerned about open, indoor space that just sits there and doesn't get used. So I'd want the requirements for what indoor space counts to be pretty clear. Everybody has access. So an exercise room seems to me like an excellent example of something that I would support counting towards and I wouldn't call it open space. I'd call it common space or something like that. So I would support that, but I'm okay if the rest of the council would prefer to shift all that space outdoors. I was the first one to raise the question of the VRNRF, however you say it. But I want to also note that almost every space that SB 35 might apply to in our town is within half a mile of public transit, and thus we probably have no parking required for almost any SB 35 project that might come through, if I understood the SB 35 conditions correctly. So that means that given that we have had issues with not enough parking in some developments, if we have no right to require any parking, then I might be swayed that a VRNRF is a way to get some on-site parking where we can't require any if we allow it to count towards open space requirements. One way to do that might be to say a VRNRF counts at 1/2 credit or something like that, so that instead of 150 or whatever our current number is of square feet per unit, that if you're going to meet that with a VRNRF, then it's got to be 300 square feet, or it basically counts at 1/2 credit towards the open space requirement. That sort of reflects the shared nature between cars and people. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Lehman.
Yeah, I had a great idea that Councilmember Sparks gave me, and Ben, you just kind of touched on it too in a slightly different fashion. Laura, when you were talking about the indoor space and the conundrum we're all kind of dealing with, recognizing there's some value to it, but having some discomfort that it's not truly open space, and this could be used perhaps in some ways that aren't the best outcome. I was going to suggest to staff as they look at this, perhaps they could come back with proposals that if indoor space is to be used as part of our public and private open space, that it perhaps is at a slightly reduced amount, a reduced percentage. Now, what that could be, is it 50%, 75%, 85%, up, down, I don't know. But I think that might be good. That way, if there's something of value that's easy for them architecturally to put in, maybe it works well for the residents, and it still doesn't make as big of a hit on our outdoor space, which I do think we're all pretty much in agreement. We really want to protect and maximize that. I too enjoy the developer comments. I want to thank staff for including those. I actually had to get a second or a third cup of coffee and a little bit of chocolate to enjoy them. To me, honestly, it was just clear. These help make it very clear why we need the clearest guidelines possible to open the doors that need to be open, to close ones that shouldn't be open, because otherwise developers will do anything. And this is not to pick them, it's just a matter of the nature of it. Their interests are based generally on a bottom line, whereas ours are based more on a requirement to represent our community and our community values. So unless something is inexpensive as possible, many or most developers probably aren't really, if you ask them, do you agree and think these are good guidelines? They're going to say, well, given a choice, no, I'd like to do it the cheap way. And they kind of, that's generally what we see, at least what I've seen for over a decade. And that's okay. It's just the way this goes. But that's why we're here. And that's why we're doing this work tonight, to try and balance that out in hopefully a positive way. And lastly, the question of window tinting. That's a good one. Again, I think somebody's looking at cost, perhaps, but it occurs to me, I agree 100% with wanting a neighborhood look and not wanting to look like downtown Los Angeles. But more than that, you can get better environmental results from a good, decent double pane glass. Of course, that's going to cost a little more. But if they want to raise concerns about environmental issues, that's the direction I'd like to go then, is requiring a certain a certain amount of heat protection from the glass itself, or rather than tinting. So just a thought. So I think that's all of it. I look forward to seeing what comes back, and I've enjoyed the discussion tonight. We'll see what comes out of this, but I think we've made our best effort at least to try and protect the interests of the people of Cotati and still meet the needs that are upon us now.
Thank you. Councilor Bahari.
Yes, thank you. I'd just like to chime in. It was almost as if Vice Mayor Landman was reading from my notes I put down here. As far as the comment letter, I read it. It was very interesting. But, you know, I always come back to our purpose on the council is really here to represent our community. And we're trying to do that in the best way that we can. And we are not here to make sure that the developers maximize their profit. As was pointed out, they're in the business to do business, and they are going to get as much profit as they possibly can squeak out of it. So I want to make sure that we represent our community. The other thing about the letter, while it was nice to receive it, in previous times when we have gotten input from developers, they were a lot more specific. In other words, if you ask us to do X, it is going to add this much to the project. If you ask us to do Y, it's going to add, then we could, you know, have a conversation. And in fact, Vice Mayor Landman will remember this when we worked through the Kessing Ranch project. There were a lot of things that the developer asked to be taken off their plate. And we actually went through them one by one, looked at the cost versus the benefit and the benefit to the community or lack thereof. But this letter didn't get into any of that. And as you pointed out, it seemed like everything was a no. So I just wanted to let you know, that's kind of how I feel about things like that. If you want us to really look at it more deeply, you need to be more specific about what it is that the problem is, not just I don't like that. I like the concept of the Vernuff, but my concern there is that while the picture had parking in it, which is I think where Councilmember Ford was headed towards it, I don't know that it requires parking. So I get what he's saying, that it would be nice if we're in an area that wouldn't require any parking, and that might get us some parking, but I don't know that the design of those requires any parking spaces. And so if we were going to do that, I'm not saying I object to that, but I would want it defined that that would have to have some of those parking spaces like in the pictures that we had. And then lastly, on the open space, I kind of like the concept of giving partial credit on that, but I'm with most of the council members. I don't want, the lobby to be considered. That I think that an exercise room does add value and benefit, and fits in that recreation definition. So I'd like to see more on that, but thank you. It was a great discussion.
Thank you. Councilmember Sparks.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say I appreciated my colleagues' discussion on the letter that we received, and I tend to agree with you, and I think it was just good and important to talk about a little bit. I'm wondering if it's possible for us to maybe reach out personally to Burbank or to some other, I know that they were already asked for comment, but I would feel more comfortable if we could get, triangulate and have at least comments from one other firm, because there might be something that we're missing. There might be something that is a legitimate issue, but since we didn't get enough comment on this, we don't know that. Does anyone on staff, can anyone address that? Like, is there a way we could reach out to somebody and really ask them to give us some feedback?
So, Council Member Sparks, two companies did respond, verbally said they were going to get me comments. Burbank was one of them. It responded immediately to my sending the letter out that they were going to comment. They did not, so I can follow up with them because they said they were going to, but they didn't. So I can easily check with them to see if they want to comment on it, because I could ask them.
That would be fantastic. Yeah, thank you.
And Councilmember Ford.
So I would, to try to implement some of the suggestions that other council members have made more specifically, I like Vice Mayor Landon's suggestion that we limit the percentage of the required open space that can be met through indoor space. And I would propose that be no more than 25% of the required open space can be met through indoor spaces that are carefully designed to be recreational in nature, so whatever. I think the current language is okay to describe which spaces count, but and I would also suggest to address Councilmember Harvey's well taken point that a VNRF doesn't necessarily require parking. That we could insert a clause that says something like, if the project provides at least one parking space per unit, then the car transit space, when designed to VNRF standards, can be counted at half credit towards the open space requirements, as kind of a prod to provide that one space per unit that we can't require.
Mayor Lemon?
I'm enjoying this as a conversation that won't quit, but it's a good one. That is a good question. First of all, what Councilmember Ford was proposing exactly what I envisioned in my suggestion that we require VNRFs, take them away from the calculation for open and private space, but require them on these developments, as well as perhaps all of our developments, because I pictured it as a place that would have probably that one or whatever's required parking. Again, if anybody's familiar, the development next to 21st Century Health, you can see that's where people, although the front doors match the streets, where people park is inside the protected area where the path is and the open green place. That's where there's the streets that serve that. So these inward facing streets that serve, I pictured as you add to the open space by making it a VNRF and the green space that's already there. That's a win. You have your street space and your parking. So I think we're kind of seeing the same thing there. But I do want to ask if staff could confirm. I thought this was the requirement for public transit was for more major transit that had certain headways or times. And I know we don't exactly have great headways or frequent arrivals of bus transportation in Cotati. So I'm not sure we meet that standard or not. I hope we don't, because I think it would be difficult to manage carless depending on transit as it currently exists in Sonoma County, but I would like to hear about that. But I do agree with the idea of using that parking space as part of the VNRF, and that's what I pictured. And lastly, I'll leave you with the thought, I really like the way staff put up the examples for the polls of here's the things we like in design, here's the things we don't want in design. And we've talked about wanting to have perhaps a little more clarity on the definition of VNRFs. I would just ask for some pictures like that. We have the one picture in our packet that I really like. Some more pictures of, yes, this is what we're looking for, the functions we see of VNRFs and what they should look like. And then here's what they shouldn't look like. And that will give us more clarity for the developer and define this well. So just my thoughts. But I would like to hear about the public transit part from staff, because I think that's important for us to know. Thank you.
On the public transit, I'll need to do some more research on that, because I believe you are correct. There's some information, I believe, about headways on what counts as public transit. My understanding on much of Cotati is within public transit based upon the bus service. So if you want us to probably map out kind of what applies and what doesn't within Cotati, we can do that.
It would be interesting. What I remember from SETA generally, Joel, is that, and this is previous legislation, so I can be wrong on this, but I thought it was a more reasonable standard than then if you had viable, regular, frequent bus that could serve the needs for a family, for work, business, and all the needs people have in their residential lives, that you might consider reducing parking. But that places that don't have that, which is a large portion of this county with a few exceptions, you might not. So that would be good for us to see when we come back. I'm hoping, I don't think we meet that standard throughout, because if we do, that's going to be a large section of everybody in this county. And it's going to be incredibly hard to have all these developments come in with increased density and then no parking. We've seen what that looks like over in San Caro. I'd hate to see that all over the whole county.
Well, I think realistically, the standard may be no parking, but just for the market, and realistically, developers are going to provide parking generally.
Good.
To make the units livable, let somebody want to live there, because if there's not frequent service on the buses, people will have cars, and developers, I would say most of them are going to want to provide parking, even if they're not required to.
If we can require it, we probably should, because somebody will come through and not care. If they can do the development and it sells out, they'll let the community and the city and whoever buys in deal with the parking problems later. And we've seen what that looks like. So, well, thank you for that.
Councilmember Ford?
I'm just curious whether there is general support among the council for doing something like half credit for Werner towards open space requirements, just to give staff some guidance in what's coming back.
Got a couple of heads nodding yes. Yeah.
Well,
So,
I'm going to say no to that only because I like the idea, but I had earlier proposed we don't give them any credit for Vertiv, so we just have them put them in. And that's what we can have this discussion when it comes back and see which way we go, what staff proposes. But I'd like to at least have the ability to look at that, because that might even be better, I think. And I think it might not be necessarily something that is problematic in terms of a project penciling out. This might be the great way of satisfying concerns about having enough public and private place for people and getting a little extra through just requiring the simple change of the streets they have to put in. They're going to put these back-facing streets in. And if we just have them slightly modify them to meet this furnace standard, I think we get a win-win.
I think that certainly gives planning and community development some things to work on in that. I think there's a lot of things that we've given input on for you, Mr. Galbraith and Mr. House. For the record, the comments from the developer, that developer has a history with Katati. And I'll let you Google that and you can go from there. We'll just leave it at that. So that I think may have colored their comments. So with that, if we don't, I think you have a lot or enough to go with, Joel and Noah?
Yes.
Because you don't really ever anticipate something passing on the first night, do you? But there is a concern that you don't want to be too onerous, that nobody's going to come in and develop it. But over the years, we've seen that developers have a tendency to exaggerate and embellish the hardships involved in developing a project. And the next thing you know, we've got some fantastic projects that have come into town. So I think it's incumbent upon us to strike a balance and say, look, it'll pencil in, really. And then when we go full solar, that'll be another issue. So with that, I think you guys have enough direction, and we will go from there. Thank you both very much for your information and patience on there.
Yeah, thank you.
Just quickly, are we asking that this be continued to a date certain or uncertain?
Unless you've got somebody that's coming in on an SB 5 right away, SB 35 right away, I don't think we need a date certain unless the other council members think that we do. Yeah. Okay. No, uncertain is fine. Okay. Thank you all so much on that. Now we will move on to our telecom and small cell guidelines.
I think that is all just being continued together as a package, correct?
Oh, pardon me. It is. It's all coming back the same. So now we'll go back over to the regular agenda item being the micro enterprise home kitchen. And I'm guessing this is where Mrs. Fields started out?
That's the rumor. Mrs. Butterworth also, I think we had this a lot, yeah. So thank you, Mayor, members of the council. So this is the term in the state statute is microenterprise home kitchen operation, and attached to the staff report is a letter from the county requesting input from all of the jurisdictions in Sonoma County on whether they think, or whether we all think, the county should opt in under the state law, and or if we have any comments about it. And I don't have a date that the county board of supervisors will be hearing this, but they have asked for all comments back by August 16th. So that's why we're talking about it tonight. And so the microenterprise home kitchen operation was created as part of Assembly Bill 626 and 377. This is in 2018, 2019, and it does differ a little bit from the earlier cottage food operation statutes, which became state law in 2012. And those were more, the cottage food was more geared towards non-perishable type operations and sale to like, not direct to consumer sales, but sales to wholesalers and that sort of thing. So the microenterprise home kitchen expanded that scope essentially by creating what would be small scale restaurants in that can exist in residentially zoned areas. And if the county, as I was starting to mention before, if the county does decide to opt in, everybody opts in. So just how the state statute operates. If they opt in, all the cities in Sonoma County will also be part of this. And so far, there's been a handful of counties around the state that have opted in, including Riverside, Solano, Santa Barbara, Alameda, and the city of Berkeley, which is not a county, obviously, but they've also opted in to active programs. And San Mateo is opted in, I guess, in a pilot program, but they're having staffing issues with their health department to implement. So one of the key features of the, before I get into kind of what's allowed and what's not allowed with these micro enterprise home kitchen operations, the state created this because they were looking to give people another avenue to, if they have an idea about food, starting up a food product, but don't have a lot of capital, maybe underserved or disadvantaged communities. They have an easy way to test out their ideas without expending a lot of capital or hiring staff and buying a brick and mortar business. And it also made the county health office the single point of contact for these in a way to sort of streamline the process, presumably for these entrepreneurs putting their toe in the water that aren't very familiar with kind of the permitting process and having to go to multiple different entities to get permitted. And so it is discussed briefly in the staff report, but if this were to pass in the county, or the county were to opt into it, and the county health office was the single permitting entity, then we would, on the back end, have to be working with the county to make sure that they have all of our requirements, such as is cited in the staff report, business license requirements for home occupations, and also, like, we also just recently talked about the polystyrene and takeout food container ordinance, so that kind of thing would apply to them. What wouldn't apply under the state statute is any sort of zoning prohibition on having a restaurant in a residential area. And by talking with our county health officer, as well as looking around at some of these other counties that have opted in, for example, Alameda County, who has opted into the program, in the entire county, they had somewhere in the range of 20 home enterprise operations across the entire county. So, and that seemed to be pretty consistent among the different counties based on what our health officer said. So it doesn't seem like the uptake has been so dramatic that it would be a significant issue where we'd have every residence pop up as a business. I guess theoretically that's possible, but hasn't been what's happened in some of the other communities that have done this so far. So with regard to the what we're calling the MICOs, the micro enterprise home kitchen operations, There's some things they can do and can't do. So they can't cater. They can't be a catering business. They're not allowed to serve certain types of foods. So they can't do oysters, milk, butter, cheese, or ice cream, presumably because some of the perishable nature of those kind of things. But if they do permit into a MECO operation, then they are under county health oversight, which is a benefit, I guess, of ensuring that there's some food safety oversight in these operations. They are only allowed to do direct to consumer sales, which is different than the cottage food operation, which are not allowed to do direct to consumer. And they could be either dine-in or take-out. And based on what I've seen and what I've heard, they primarily would be take-out operations. And just because I think people generally don't want people hanging out in their house or in their backyard eating like a dining room. So generally they tend to be takeout, and they have to be their own delivery person. And they only can have one employee. They have to have less than $50,000 in annual revenue. They're allowed a maximum of 30 meals in a day or 60 meals in a week. So I think that was anticipating maybe someone doing it on the weekend, Saturday, Sunday, but not every day of the week. We would still be able to enforce, although we couldn't enforce a zoning ordinance that said you can't have restaurants in residential areas. We could enforce our nuisance ordinances. So if there's noise or other types of nuisances, we could enforce those. I mean, granted, we are limited in how much enforcement we can do based on our bandwidth of our enforcement abilities, but it is technically possible to do nuisance abatements if they become a problem for some reason. And one other thing I'll just say that they're not allowed to do is they're not allowed to put any signage out on the exterior of their residence. So that would be another sort of common sort of thing that neighbors might not appreciate. And a lot of, there's also an internet-based exchange type system that's set up around these, where these MECOs can post their location and the type of foods they serve on this internet platform that people can go and look up and see where these micro enterprise home kitchen operations are and presumably order through them. And a couple other things I will just point out more as a question than a concern at this point, but something that if the council does want to provide endorsement of this to the county, we would convey also, or I would suggest conveying in our comments to the county, is that that we understand how alcohol sales would be handled in these kind of operations. ABC is relatively vague about it. They would have to be a bona fide restaurant, but I'm not sure exactly what that means in this context. So, you know, you wouldn't want, well, I wouldn't think you would want a lot of, especially if it's in-house dining, a lot of alcohol sales necessarily, but that's a question I would say that would be probably worth asking the county if we do endorse this generally. And also, I do believe that that cannabis-infused goods are not allowed to be sold out of these, but again, that's a question that I'm not 100% certain on tonight. So perhaps another question for the county. And that is pretty much it, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Abed. Let's see if the council has any questions at this point. Vice Mayor Lehman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, a couple of questions for you. Let's see. So you mentioned that if the county does grandfather us into this, we would have no control and couldn't stop the use of having a restaurant in a residential neighborhood. But you mentioned that we could allow enforcement of noise and nuisance ordinances, but I'm not really clear how we would enforce noise from, let's say, cooking operations or traffic or let's spitball, cooking orders, whatever could arise from this, however unlikely, would we really have any practical control over that? Would they ultimately still be able to do what they're doing because they have the right to be a restaurant? That's one question. And then secondly, are there any limits to how many homes on a block or in a neighborhood or in a geographical area can do this? Now, right now we're talking 30 meals a day potentially, which could be 30 vehicle trips at dinner time, let's say, or 60 a week. It could spread out a lot of different ways. That may be problematic for some neighbors, but if we were to buck the trend and have a few people decide to do this, if this started to grow, then we would have to allow it once we've agreed to it as a county. What would that impact be? Could this not kind of grow to be much more problematic in terms of impacts on the communities? So those are the two general questions I had.
So with your second question first, I'm not aware of, at least in the statute anyway, to limit them. Whether the county could, I know the county is actively looking at if there's additional local controls that can be put in place, but as I understand it, there's really not very many that could be put in place. So, I mean, for example, the county's looking at groundwater, because now think on unincorporated county, they're thinking groundwater usage and, and I think the wineries, if someone sets up like a winery tasting room restaurant or something, they're looking at those kind of things. If there's ways that they can provide some measure of, I don't know, some boundaries on it. At this point, the county hasn't said that they are able to put many boundaries on it. So worst case scenario, I mean, you could have a bunch all in one block. I mean, maybe, Cotati has 5 of them in the county and they're all like on one street. I think that
would be our luck.
Yeah, that's possible. I believe, I can certainly, I think like tonight, part of the exercise or part of this conversation tonight is what kind of concerns we want to pass along as well, even if we,
I had the general concern. They're asking us, I mean, we don't really have control over this, but I do appreciate, and I hope you'll pass along our appreciation for them reaching out to get our input ahead of time. That's always appreciated by the cities in this. But they are asking us to give a thumbs up or down tonight. And without knowing exactly how this is going to play out, all I can go by what is in the packet. I think that's all we can go by. And I have to make a call, at least personally, and my colleagues do based on what's in that. And I would have some concerns with vague things that the county, or particularly county health, if they're admitting this, maybe looking into seeing how they can do this. That kind of means nothing. I'm probably expecting a worse outcome from that than a good one based on past experience. And then the enforcement, real quickly. I mean, what sort of teeth would we really have if one of these became just a red hot place where we're getting constant complaints and valid complaints from neighbors because of traffic, noise, you name it? Which is perhaps a little unlikely, but it's still well within the realm of possibility. There's a reason we don't have restaurants in residential neighborhoods previously.
Yeah, I mean, with respect to parking and traffic, to the extent that we could enforce vehicle code, we could do that. If there's certain issues that would violate the vehicle code, but not otherwise, I don't think we would do anything there and within the street. Within the operations, I do believe that as I understand it, we still do have control over the noise ordinance and other types of nuisance abatement. So if the property gets, in a nuisance condition, although we can't enforce zoning to preclude the restaurant, but we could try to contain it with nuisance abatement type actions if there's.
So there might be some room to work there, but in the thing that I think maybe one of the more frustrating things for the neighbors in the region, the issue of parking spaces that they usually share being potentially taken at times. It sounds like we wouldn't have much to do with that. And I picture it, where I live, it's kind of a small little area. And every once in a while, a couple times a year, one of us neighbors will have a family gathering, at least before the pandemic we did. And on that day, it's really tough to drive. It's really tough to park, and we all put up with it, and it's fine. But if that was to happen on a more regular basis because somebody was profiting from it, I do think that could be frustrating to the public, and it concerns me. It sounds like we might not have any way to really control that if we go along with this. So thank you for the input. That sheds a little light on that, makes it clearer to me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Landman. I'm not sure if you were aware, but we were not able to see your frustration because I don't think your camera's on.
But it was clear in your voice.
I'm not going to ask, but it might be an advantage not to have the camera on at this point. I don't know. I'll put it back on. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you, Mr. Ford. I'm glad I came across as I wanted.
Thank you. Councilmember Ford.
Yeah, I just had one question, and I'll save comments till we get to the discussion. But the requirement that you be your own delivery driver, is that really a prohibition on employees? I'm wondering about the possibility of them using Uber Eats or DoorDash. Are those specifically prohibited?
They are specifically prohibited, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Councilmember Harvey.
Thank you. This really seems like a commercial operation in a residential area. I find it a little bit frustrating. I'm not convinced here, based upon the comments that were made by the city manager, that we have any recourse at all. It sounds like there's a thought that maybe we could use a nuisance or noise, but I'm having a hard time. It seems like those really aren't ordinances for this particular purpose. So I think we'd have like a hard time proving these things. I don't know what kind of vehicle code things people could do. It's not like they're going to park for over 72 hours to pick up their food, so we can't get them on leaving their car. I'm having a hard time I'm not convinced that we have any recourse. And I'm not understanding, it says in the staff report that staff does not believe that there will be any nuisance issues. And I was wondering, well, what is that based on? Because I don't know that, given some of these neighborhoods, that folks might perceive this as a nuisance if all kinds of strange cars are coming, next door to them at all different times of day and night and, whatever. So I'm not sure what that's based on. And I was interested in what is the county's plan for inspections? Are they going to be regularly inspecting these residences to make sure that they're meeting the health and safety codes? And it seems to me, based upon comments that I've heard out in the community, that the county health department has a hard time doing that function with the commercial restaurants that are out and about in the county. So I'm having a hard time imagining that they're going to have extra bandwidth to now be able to go out and check homes also. So I was wondering what their plan was on that. And then how is it that the county thinks that this is going to affect our water and sewer? Because really you're kind of adding a commercial load in a residential area. And as we all know, like right now, we're in a drought and we're asking people to cut back. But if you have a food operation like a restaurant, that is going to require more water and sewer usage. So I was wondering what, the thought process was with that. So those are my questions for right now.
Yeah.
So kind of in reverse order. I know the county is concerned about grease in particular, specifically with septic systems. They haven't expressed a concern about water use necessarily. And I think in terms of, they would be inspecting these, is what they've said. They'd be physically inspecting them. And
How often?
I believe it's, I was looking to see if I had written it down, but I thought it was annually.
Wow.
But I think the county is going off this assumption, county health is going off this assumption based on what they've seen in other counties, and they're expecting that countywide it may be, 20 to 30 of these. So they're not thinking it's going to be like hundreds of them. I think that's why so far they feel like they could accommodate that kind of use. And in terms of like parking, obviously we wouldn't be getting people on 72 hours. I was thinking more on the lines of like, if they're double parking on the street to run in and get food or whatever, potentially.
But then you'd have to have an officer be sitting there outside these places and watching, and that doesn't seem, a reasonable thing to do. And if the neighbors called and said that, oh, someone's double parked, by the time you got an officer out there, then the person would be gone. So that.
Yeah, I mean, granted, nuisance issues almost are by definition often transitory, and you kind of have to be in the right place at the right time to catch them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the kind of nuisance issues we're talking about, like noise and.
Right. And you mentioned, the septic and grease, but don't restaurants have to have special grease things in place?
Yeah.
Terminology escapes me right this second.
Yeah. Right. Grease traps.
Thank you.
Yeah. Restaurants are required to have grease traps. These ones under statute are not, just because they're deemed low enough volume that they wouldn't need them. I think that's why they were exempted under state statute.
I don't know that we can guarantee that. And then whose problem is it if there's a problem?
Yeah, I mean, if there's a significant grease issue, then it'd either show up in their own plumbing, or it would show up in the in the laterals, the lateral to the main potentially, and it would be something that we would have to. It would be like essentially a nuisance issue we'd have to deal with that property owner.
But that's a great example, because if grease showed up in the lateral, how would you prove that it was because that person in neighborhood XYZ had a restaurant and it wasn't something else? I mean, how would you prove that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if they're permitted as a micro enterprise business, then I mean, we would be aware of it, right? And if they have especially more than one grease problem that we respond to, then it would become kind of a trend. And I would imagine that we could we could apply some reasonable standards if it's actually an issue, not a grease trap, but the answer to your question is I don't exactly know what our recourse would be, other than working with the property owner and trying to solve the problem. We couldn't shut the restaurant down necessarily, but potentially working with county health, we could do something.
And that seems to be a problem, because it feels like we have a lot more capabilities and tools in the tool box for commercial operations. And it seems like this can just do whatever it wants to do, and we don't really have tools to kind of help us if there's a problem.
Well, yeah, I mean, we don't have use permits or, zoning requirements, things like that we would apply to a commercial operation.
Right.
We would just be using, working with county health on health related issues or nuisance type enforcements to try to keep them from disturbing their neighbors, if that were to be an issue.
So, but based upon our noise ordinance, it really would be dependent upon neighbors complaining that, let's just say for argument's sake, they have patio dining out in their backyard and it's noisy to the neighbors. There's certain times that you can make noise. And I don't know that the neighbors would really have much recourse other than to close their windows and not use their own yards.
Yeah, so with noise, I mean, we have our noise ordinance. You're talking about hours of operation.
Right.
I'm not sure.
Damien, I could just comment a little bit. You have your noise ordinance, which maybe would apply, but you'd have to measure the violations and from certain locations and prove the violation. It's a lot of work. In the nuisance context, if the city or private parties can enforce nuisance as well, they'd have to demonstrate that the noise was such that it was beyond what a reasonable person would expect in that neighborhood, and convince a judge or even potentially a jury that it was unreasonable. The level of noise was unreasonable. It's going to be hard to make a case. It's really expensive to pursue a nuisance because there's so much proof required. It doesn't seem like it'd be a very realistic option to pursue. I guess if the cooking has an odor issue or smoke, I suppose that could rise to the level of being sort of beyond what one would expect in a residential neighborhood. And if there was constant noise, 5 tables in the backyard every night from 5 to 10 p.m., that seems to go a little beyond what you would expect in a residential neighborhood. So there's probably a point at which these activities could have sufficient characteristics to prove a nuisance case, but it's a lot of effort.
That's what I was concerned about, is that it would be a lot of effort, just like even the traffic issue. It'd be a lot of effort for us to have.
Yeah, the parking, I don't know that you could ever make a case, a public nuisance case around parking. But if an enforcement officer was sitting out there and watching violations time after time, you might be able to make a case, or you could cite the individual drivers. But if the activity where there was constant double parking was caused by the business, I guess you could make a nuisance claim out of that.
But it sounds like a lot of work. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think from what I have heard and talking to the health officer, the vast majority of this would be takeout. You could, so Councilmember Harvey, the worst case scenario would be they're limited to 60 meals in a week. You had like a Friday night where they had 60 different meals served. That would be a worst case. I think it's unlikely, but that, otherwise it would be 30 over a weekend, maybe, 30 each day on a weekend, something like that. I haven't heard that these have been issues in the other counties. Generally speaking, not to say there's not an individual operator out there that's a problem somewhere in one of these communities, but generally speaking, the feedback I've gotten is that they don't become nuisance issues or any sort of significant nuisance issues. But that's obviously not a guarantee. You always could get an individual operator that's a problem.
And it feels like we have no recourse and we can't do anything about it once this gets put in place. It's kind of by right.
As the city attorney said, the nuisance abatements can tend to be just challenging cases to bring generally. We're also very limited in how much bandwidth we have So we tend to focus on health and safety issues more than have a lot of bandwidth for like these kind of issues.
Right.
I would just say, Damien and Mayor and Council, this is your chance to have input here. Offering this letter to the board, and also showing up at the board meeting. If you don't want these operations in the community at this point, then this is where you have probably the most leverage you're ever going to have with these operations, just because of the way the law operates.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Councilmember Sparks?
Just had a quick question. I do have comments, but I feel like we veered already into a discussion, but I'll save them for after public comment. The question I had was if the county implements this and then it goes really badly and there are a lot of problems with it, can the county decide to pull out of it later? What would that look like?
So I believe, although maybe the city attorney may have a different opinion on this, but my understanding is that if the county were to opt in, I think they could opt out at a later point. But
I'm not certain. I didn't see that in the legislation, but I'll look it up now.
Okay. But I'm not 100% certain of that, but it seemed like it was all in, all out kind of operation of the statute.
Councilmember Ford? I'm sorry, Councilmember Sparks, was that it?
That was it. Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
I didn't want to jump the gun on that. Councilmember Ford?
Just one additional quick question on the whole issue that Councilmember Harvey was talking about. Isn't the business license also some leverage? Can we not revoke a business license for some issues?
I don't know. Angela, are there any circumstances where a business license would be revoked
So a business license is in effect a tax. And so as long as they are paying that tax and they're providing relevant and accurate information that they're attesting to, because it would be based on a home type business where they report out the gross receipts. And that's just a personal attestation of what they say they are receiving, and that's taxable gross receipts for the business. There's no other leverage for revoking or not providing a business license at this point in time other than a zoning or alarm type requirements from the police department.
Okay, thanks.
The way this is drafted and some of the concerns that came up, especially some of the ones that Councilmember Harvey was addressing, it seems we'd almost need a CSI Katati, and I don't want to really go there. So, Councilmember Harvey, you have another question?
Yeah, I do. Councilmember Ford's comment kind of made me think about, what about the fire department? Have they weighed in on this at all? I mean, might there be some safety concerns with this kind of operation at home? I'm just curious.
I do not know if we haven't reached out to the fire department. I don't know if the county has also reached out to them.
Would be good to get their opinion on that, I would think.
Okay, with that, not seeing any further hands up, I'm going to open it up for public comments.
Thank you, Mayor Moore. We have no attendees.
Thank you, Ms. Burgess. I'll bring it back to the council. I do want to say something on this. Although I'm not opposed to small entrepreneurship and people having their own business in this type of situation, this sounds like an allowance that would be much more suited for the city of Berkeley, San Mateo, some places where you may have houses that are more in a closer to a business district, greater proximity to that, and not so much in a residential area, or some of the residential areas that are like a mixed use maybe. So that's my thoughts on that. And with that, I'll bring it back to the council and Councilmember Sparks.
Thank you, Mayor Moore. I am in favor of this. Generally, I'm very respectful of the concerns that everyone's brought up, but the reason that I'm in favor of it it comes down to this one line on packet page 210, which is the legislature found that many of these small scale businesses already exist and they should be legalized and regulated so they can operate with appropriate food safety regulation. I would be really surprised if we didn't have a couple of these operating in Cotati already without our knowledge. It's been my experience living in other places that I've been aware of businesses like this operating under the radar. They typically were 100% delivery and pickup. I've never been aware of a business like this that had a significant dine-in component, so that part's a little weird to me. But you know, I've been aware of, and they also mentioned in the packet that this creates significant economic opportunities for people of color and immigrants and women who there are just too many barriers for them to get into business otherwise, but this allows them to start. And that's been my personal experience too. I've known someone who ran a little tamale operation out of her home, and it was sort of under I don't think it was legal, but it was a small scale business. So I think that these things are happening already, and I think it would be good to legislate them, legalize them, and improve the food safety by having them inspected. And that would also help people who are doing these things already to engage with government and learn about how to get a license and possibly provide a stepping stone to a larger business in the future. So I'm very in favor of the general idea of this. I'm hoping the county can work out some of the bugs.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Linda.
Yeah, interesting discussion again tonight. I think Mr. Bacher had a quote that I wrote down because it summed it up well. When talking about where this would be problematic, he said something a judge would be finding beyond what you would expect in a residential area. And I think that's the essential problem here. The idea, the goal is a good one, but it's a small, if perhaps not even non-existent problem in my perception. And we're trying to create something that could be problematic to solve this. It just doesn't make any sense to me, honestly. It would result potentially for the people in our community in some reduction in the quality of their life. Now, of course, it's incredibly small. I recognize that, but still another small reduction, the things they see day in and day out. And I guess my bottom line is, why would we add more nuisance, no matter how small it is, to public life? There's clear reasons that we have zoning. And indeed, that's why people support and have local government to protect zoning, so people don't start opening up a blacksmith place in their garage or a cannery in their backyard. And that's not such a big stretch, because nobody would expect somebody having dining restaurants at their next door neighbor's house multiple nights a week. I hate to be a negative voice in this, but I personally am going to move that we send a letter not endorsing this because of the numerous legitimate concerns we have and the lack of clarity of what control, if any, there will be over this. Seeing this as our one time to weigh in with the knowledge we've been given, I don't really see another choice.
Councilmember Ford.
Thanks.
That's a motion on the table, by the way. I see if there's a second.
Yeah, I haven't heard one, so I'll proceed.
I would second that motion.
Thank you.
I didn't realize it was a motion, sorry.
My apologies.
So we have a motion and a second on the floor. I will continue the discussion and we can take the vote on the motion. Councilmember Ford.
Thanks. I agree with Councilmember Sparks about the overriding benefit of this possibility far outweighs the, to me, rather fanciful worst case scenarios that many people foresee. I do think dine-in is problematic, and that's most of the concerns that have been raised, and that's another question I would include in the letter, or a suggestion. If we did send a letter, I would prefer we send a letter saying we support and would support, especially if the county could limit the authority to take out. So I don't know if that's possible with the state legislation. I just think to say there's no benefit and that the only possibility is the potential reduction in quality of life from a few car trips is just not recognizing the fact that many people are trying to find a way to start a new business, find their way into the workforce or into being a small business person. And currently that route is extremely difficult and extremely expensive. And to boot, that I was going to talk more about what Councilmember Sparks did about this is really trying to bring existing under the radar operations into compliance and put them under the authority of county health. And I think to turn this down just tells everybody, keep it under the radar, keep cooking and, including products that would be prohibited under this scheme. Just keep doing them without telling county health, without getting a business license, without paying tax to the city, et cetera. So I think the potential benefits outweigh the potential drawbacks that people have raised.
Thank you. Councilmember Sparks?
Thank you. One thing I forgot to mention was thinking back to my earlier question, if we could add the noise ordinance to a future agenda. Perhaps that's a way we could address some of these concerns. Is we could, if we do go forward to take a look at our noise ordinance, and I don't know if y'all heard there was a leaf blower right outside my yard while I was trying to talk last night. So there's another concern. But anyway, maybe we could write in something in the noise ordinance to specifically deal with home MECO businesses, something like that.
Thank you. Councilmember Harvey?
Yes, I'm not sure that we have much leeway in changing the way this legislative Assembly Bill 626 was written. So I think the things around dining in, which seem awkward to me, I support the concept of getting people, off the ground and started, but I think I would prefer to see a better effort in maybe community kitchens or co-op kitchens or, incubator kitchens, things like that, where people can, get off the ground and do that kind of thing. And also a lot of folks that make things also attend a lot of the farmers markets. So it's not like that avenue isn't still available for people to be able to make their products and sell them at farmers markets. We certainly see that, every week. The creative things that people make always amaze me. So I don't know that we're really closing down folks, but it just feels like there's too much unknown. I would like to be more definitive in what our capabilities are and how we can support the whole community. And I don't feel like those answers are in here. I'd really like to see if some of these other communities have actually done this, what is their experience? Let's have a bunch of real data on how that worked out. What were the pros and cons and what worked and what didn't work? I just don't feel like we have that information at this point.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we have a motion and a second. We have some discussion. My final thoughts on this are the concept. I think is great. I think it would help to help those individuals that are in that position. I don't think Assembly Bill 626 fits for the County of Sonoma, and I think if the county wants to look at something that they should look at their own, that would be inclusive of input from all of the cities and address a lot of these concerns. So with that, I will call for a roll call vote. Ms. Burgess.
Councilmember Harvey.
No.
Councilmember Sparks.
Can we please have a clarification of the
Yeah.
motion that we're voting on?
Oh, sorry.
I would have thought Susan would have wanted to vote the other way.
My
Well,
understanding
maybe I
was,
voted backwards.
my understanding was the motion was to not support this.
Oh, okay. Then I'm a yes. Sorry. My mistake.
Is that correct, Vice Mayor Lemon?
That was what I moved, yes. Thank you.
Sorry. I got it backwards. My
Okay.
Because
bad.
I'd be happy to accept your no vote on this.
And actually, before you finish that motion, just to make sure I'm clear on it, it's a letter to the county basically saying that that based on the information available now, you don't support opting in, and the issues are nuisance issues, parking issues, saturation, potential saturation of uses geographically. Concerns about grease in the sewer system, hours of operation, which I guess would kind of be a nuisance under the nuisance category. Dine-in service being problematic, so takeout only. And tangentially, just some of the questions that were brought up initially: alcohol and cannabis use in the food products potentially being just unknown at this time, and some of the concerns at this point. Does that encompass everything on this motion, at least?
On the existing motion to not recommend endorsement of this, that's my understanding of that.
Right, and I would say as the mover that what the city manager captured would be the basis for that motion. So I think that's reflective of the discussion and the concerns I heard. I will say honestly, if I thought this was something, as Mayor Morris suggested, a county proposal for discussion on a county rule, where we could have some back and forth. I think some back and forth would be good, and there might be some middle ground that could be workable to capture those few small occasions where this might be beneficial while avoiding some of the problems we see. But seeing as a state law where it's either you get it or you don't, and there's not a lot of flexibility and a lot of clarity again from county health, that's the only reason in this position. So to my colleagues that wanted to vote no on this, I get what you're saying. I do hear you. If it was different, I'd be supporting you on this, but because it's not, I really can't. So thank you for that digression. Yeah, that's what the city manager put forward did cover my understanding of this particular motion, Mr. Mayor.
Councilmember Ford.
Before we continue with the vote, I wanted to ask if the council would be comfortable adding to what the city manager said in the letter, a request that the county consider starting a dialogue with the cities to devise its own program that's specific to the needs of Sonoma County and its cities. That if that is in the letter that we send to the board, then I would be comfortable voting yes for that.
I'd be happy to amend my motion to add that with a small caveat that we request as usual, plenty of time to work with the county, that they make sure they involve the cities fully, as we always ask, and they hopefully generally do. But with that, I'd be happy to include it.
So that, I'm sorry, just to clarify, and that's you're talking about like developing like a model kind of ordinance for the county that would maybe parallel some of the elements of this statute, but not adopt the statute.
And fit the county better.
Right.
Okay.
Councilmember Harvey.
Yes, thank you. The other thing that was mentioned, Damien, are the points that Mr. Bacher brought up about the financial costs should we have to get into litigation on this, and the unknown nature of it. That's an unknown, and it could be costly for us to pursue any of this.
Pursuing nuisance abatement can be
Correct. Yeah. It's not financially prudent for us to get into a lot of these.
Okay, just for clarification, Mr. Bacher, do you have the clarity on that motion?
I think I do. Damien listed all the items. Was the motion maker okay with adding the language relative to costs associated with nuisance abatement?
Yes, I am.
And then I think we would need to have a revote. There was at least one aye vote that should be revoted given the changes in the motion since the vote.
Okay. So currently the motion is to not support the county on this particular enterprise, micro enterprise in this exact form, and these are the reasons why.
And this would be a letter from the mayor.
Right.
In addition, the motion was amended to include an invitation to the county to develop its own program with Katati support as well.
Yes.
Okay with the second on that, Ms. Harvey?
Yes.
Terrific. So we have a motion and a second, and we have a roll call.
Councilmember Harvey.
Yes.
Councilmember Sparks.
No.
Councilmember Ford.
Yes.
Vice Mayor Landman.
Yes.
Mayor Moore.
Yes. Thank you very much. It seemed like we took a simple issue and made it complicated, but that's us. But that's okay. It makes it.
You're muted, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. With that, I guess, Councilmember Harvey, did you have another question or concern? No? Now we move on to our city manager's reports.
All right. Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. So I'll start with everyone's favorite subject, which is COVID. So as you all know, we're continuing to see a rise again in Sonoma County, particularly among the unvaccinated, which according to the CDC constitute about over 99% of all hospitalizations and deaths due to COVID in the US at this time.
Shocking.
Yeah, in response to this and what appears to be a significant increase in the Delta variant, I think everyone also knows the county health officer also issued 2 orders recently, last week, that masks are required in public indoor spaces, regardless of vaccination status. And as we talked about earlier this meeting, public safety personnel are required to provide proof of vaccination or be tested weekly for COVID-19 beginning on September 1, 2021. Also, as we talked about, there is a mobile site here in Katati that's at the St. Joseph's Park and Ride at the corner of 116 and Old Railroad Highway across from Pete's Coffee, and that they are there on Wednesdays from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And more information there is available on our website and social media. So switching gears for the drought, we are currently trending at a little over 27% below the same period in 2020. And as you recall, the requirement, the threshold is 20%. So we're doing better than we need to right now, but that's a good thing because as we get into the wintertime, a lot of our outdoor irrigation use is going to go away, but our requirement of 20% stays through December. So we may need the extra savings at the end of the year. And it's a total, by the way, it's not a month to month, 20% requirement. And then we are holding a second drought drop-off or drop-by event on August 21st from 8:30 to 12:30 in the morning. And these are free water saving kits that are handed out at City Hall in front of the community center. The Cash for Grass rebate program has been raised from $1 a square foot to $1.50 per square foot for lawn replaced up to a maximum of $750 per customer. This is residential. And those have been relaxed to encourage people to convert your lawns. The slurry seal project in the bird section is wrapping up. They're still working on some repairs to the slurry seal. Apparently a garbage truck drove over some of the slurry seal streets before they were ready. So those are being repaired right now, but this constitutes many of the streets on either side of Myrtle Avenue and is typical of the type of maintenance treatments that will be more commonplace once all the more costly reconstruction is, to get through that backlog. On that topic, the West Side Street Project, which is the majority of the west side of Cotati between West Sierra and 116. That bid is out right now, so contractors are bidding on it. We expect to open bids on the 24th, and if everything goes as planned, we would have that on the next council meeting for potential award. The community center roof replacement project. So it was going along great. There was a supply issue. The roof panels were shipped in damaged, so they were all sent back, and they take weeks to refabricate. So we may be waiting a bit, but the good news is that the roof is watertight at the moment, at least provided we don't get a giant deluge in water, it should be okay. But that got a little delayed, so we are moving forward on that. That was a great success, and one of the elements that you probably saw out there was that we brought in Mi Pueblo this year to do the food service, to minimize the food handling for COVID reasons. In prior years, we've grilled barbecued hamburgers primarily, and the customers would put on the toppings, but that didn't seem like the greatest idea this year. So we did kind of food prep, and then the finished food product was handed to the customer. So making it more COVID safe. Also, something that we've been doing for a while, but I didn't get a chance to talk about it last week due to the length of the meeting, was that the police department has been adding weekly event logs to the city website on the police page. And these are all the calls to service that the police respond to. Not just, and you may or may not know this, but the community voice only publishes a subset of them, but the one on our website includes all of the calls for service. For recreation, this weekend, we are having the 28th annual Kids Day parade and festival in downtown Cotati at La Plaza Park. And the theme is a very merry unbirthday, where we're celebrating all of the missed birthday party celebrations from 2020 and 2021. And starting at 9 a.m., parade entrance can line up at City Hall and East School Street like usual. We're still taking parade participants if you'd like to join in the fun. And the parade starts at 10 a.m., where it makes its way down to La Plaza Park. And the festival is from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. And it'll include talent shows on the stage and a lot of other games, including the diaper derby race, which we have done every year. And there's all sorts of other activities that, if you are interested in going, I'd highly encourage it. It should be great. And also just a quick thank you to a premier sponsor for the event, Oliver's Market, which will have over 500 cupcakes to give away to celebrate everyone's unbirthday this year. Farmers Market continues through the summer at La Plaza Park every Wednesday through the end of September from 4:30 to 7:30 p.m. And if you haven't been there, of course, come on by. There's lots of great things there, to both food and other things to sample and buy. The Accordion Festival is scheduled for September 25th and 26th in La Plaza Park. And for more information or tickets, you can go to CotatiFest.com. And like always, you can always contact Ashley Wilson at 665-4222 or wilson@cotaticity.org, or our city website or Facebook page for more information on any recreation events. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rabid. Councilmember Ford, you have a question?
Yeah, just one quick one about the water use reduction. Is that 27%? That's the reduction in our Sonoma water use. How much of that is sort of well supplementation? How much of it is actual use reduction?
I'm sorry. The use reduction is about the number I have here on the consumer side is about 11% is use reduction, and then local supply is the remainder at this time. But it seems to be trending upward in terms of better conservation.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a little worrying. We're lucky we have the wells to supplement, but it would be awfully nice to see our users hitting the 20% target at large. I'm wondering when the next phase of our water conservation ordinance is triggered. How does that get triggered?
Well, right now, so we're just following the state order and the water agency supply situation. If I think practically speaking, what would trigger it is if the reservoirs end up dropping quicker than anticipated, or there's other, the storage curves, or the in-stream flow starts becoming harder to maintain for some reason, then I can imagine additional restrictions. But at this point, that hasn't occurred, so I would imagine that would be the trigger.
Okay, but some of the other local jurisdictions have moved to mandatory restrictions, and I'm wondering, is that because they don't have local supply to backfill?
Yeah, so there's a variety of reasons. So like in Sonoma County, for example, Santa Rosa doesn't really have local supply to speak of, and so they've gone mandatory. And then some of the communities north of Dry Creek, which don't have access to water agency water, have more draconian. And same with Marin County. That's their situation as well.
Okay, thanks.
I don't see any further questions from the council. Thank you, Mr. O'Biv. Now we'll move on to City Council member reports. Member Sparks.
Thank you. Two things. One real quick, the ad hoc committee, Councilmember Harvey and I have talked about setting up a community conversation open to the public on Saturday, September 18th from 10 a.m. to noon. And we're going to try to do it in a tent outdoors because of Delta COVID. So that's one thing. Then I also wanted to give an update. The Health Action Committee met on Friday, and there was a really extensive conversation with the police chief from Santa Rosa about their implementation of their crisis response, their Cahoots-like system that they're getting off the ground. So I wanted to share with you some of the details about that because it differs from ours in a few really interesting ways. They hired the Whitebird Clinic directly as a consultant, and they're calling their model In Response. It's going to be the name of the team, In Response. And they're calling the team that will go on each van as a Cahoots Plus model. It's going to be a 3-person team consisting of a licensed mental health clinician, a paramedic rather than an EMT, and a homeless outreach specialist. They decided to include the homeless outreach specialist because in speaking with some other larger cities like Denver and Portland, in those cities, they found that as many as 60% of their calls were related to homelessness. And so that seemed to justify having a homeless outreach specialist on the team. They are planning to divert calls directly to In Response, so there won't always be a police presence going with them, and they're going to be doing welfare checks. One major difference from our model is that it's initially going to be 7 days a week, 10 hours a day. And they have a 3-year plan. They're hoping to start that in October and have a 3-year plan to seek out new funding sources to get to 24 hours eventually. But it seems like the trade-off that our consultant is recommending was a good one to me, which is not to include the licensed mental health clinician and only have a 2-person team and be able to operate 24 hours a day. So that's going to be a major difference between the two models. Bill Carter from Sonoma County Behavioral Health also mentioned that he's in contact with the city. So hopefully he's having conversations with Damien about finding crisis care for mobile units or CCMU funding and trying to gather up requests from the cities so that the county can submit one proposal and then sort of share the funding with the cities. And they were also talking about holding on to Measure O funding, which is very flexible, and trying to see what can be done to fund programs with federal and state funding and then use the Measure O funding to fill in local gaps. So that was the gist of a 45-minute discussion crammed into a couple of minutes. Thank you. Oh, one other thing. I'm so sorry. I forgot. One other thing is we had a report highlighting the incidence of opioid overdoses. The opioid crisis has sort of taken a backseat in the news with all the other problems we've been having this year. But there was a very alarming report that compared to a few years ago in 2017, in Sonoma County, we were responding to an overdose roughly every 8 days. In 2020, that rose to responding to an opioid overdose every 2.5 days. So the opioid crisis has gotten a lot worse in the last few years. And that sort of highlights the importance of having Narcan on board on our safe vans, hopefully in the future. All right, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Councilmember Harvey.
Yes, since most of my stuff's already gotten reported by Damien and Laura, the only thing that I'd like to add on the water is because of the situation that we have and trying to allocate the water. They have been working on a water allocation methodology, and it looks like we finally have come to an agreement. Had a meeting on Monday with that one city that we knew was having issues with it, and it looks like we worked through all that. And Mr. Scott reported that the TAC approved the methodology once we got past this other issue. And so we will be having a special meeting on September 13th to hopefully approve that allocation methodology, but it has to be unanimous. And that was the important thing that we had to explain, was that if this new methodology is not accepted by all the cities, it goes back to the old one from 2006, and it has some flaws with it that we really would like to try and avoid. So Damien reported on all the rest of the water things, and I've got meetings the rest of the week. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Lemon.
Yeah, I wanted to report just on one general, more long-term thing from our last week's Sonoma Clean Power meeting, mostly because I thought it was kind of good news, a little something out of the blue and somewhat hopeful, because certainly we don't get enough of that the last few years, I think. So here's a small thing I hope will put a smile and we can all cross our fingers for. Our staff began a discussion with the board about trying to leverage some potentially newer emerging geothermal technologies, which they're becoming aware of or starting to look more closely at, rather. Getting involved in the research and development of these for us. And their interest goes to three main characteristics. Number one, significantly lower water use than normal to be able to generate steam. Application in a much larger areas, more varied regions than traditional geothermal, which needs essentially the rarity of very, very hot rocks relatively close to the surface. And then lastly, something that all geothermal shares, which is that 24-hour a day times 7 days a week output, because that's incredibly valuable partnering with solar and wind to provide constant 100% renewable energy. That combined with storage, it begins to be something we can actually say we can get there with certainty. So they're working and looking into having a potential partnership between three counties, ourselves, Mendocino, and Lake, to identify areas in our regions, county-owned land, that might have good geothermal development potential. They're also working with developers, as well as most importantly, looking to state and federal officials to understand the potential for grant funding, because this would be a larger effort and would be type the thing of where Sonoma Clean Power would be contracting for market cost for many years for this, but would be looking for federal help likely for the funding to get there to build this. So at any rate, this is all research, but I think it's better than the typical, at least I believe and hope, it's better than the typical thing you see on the internet, because if our staffs looked into it and are actually intrigued enough to commit a fairly significant amount of staff time to work on it, I think there's hopefully good potential here. So as more develops, I'll certainly bring it back and share it with the board and the council.
Thank you. I don't see anything from council member 4. I guess you're good this week. Okay, and then we have our mayors and council members association meeting coming up on Thursday. We will also be discussing the ad hoc on the continuum of care. And I do not have that with me, but I will share it with the fellow council members and we can post it. But there's a 6-point program that they want to present, or at least have the mayors look at to present to their city councils on what a ideal continuum of care structure might look like, and then hopefully the county might adopt that. And then we have a presentation by KPMG on homelessness and housing, and a presentation on Measure L. So those will all be on Thursday. We were certainly hoping to be able to host that, but with the Delta variant, we cannot do that. So that's what's happening in that front. And with that, I will now move on to public comment on non-action agenda items. Vice Mayor Lemon, did you still have something you want to add to that?
I did not, Mr. Mayor. Apologies.
No, thank you very much.
Mayor Moore, we have no attendees.
Thank you very much, Ms. Burgess. And do we have any information received after the agenda was posted?
Nothing further.
Thank you. So with that, we will now move into a closed session on conference with unrepresented employees, represented city manager, or designee employee organization unrepresented. So it is 9 p.m. I will close the main session. We'll go into closed session at 9:05, and then we'll report out after that. And Mr. Obed, I assume that we already have our secondary Zoom link.
Yes, it could be in your email or on your calendar.
Thank you. So we will see you in 5 minutes. Over. Ready, Gerson? I'm just going into closed session, but it's not going to be long. I said I'm going into closed session, but it's not going to be long. Up first. Yeah. Right, so you're stuck with them.
So I thought, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not, wasn't that much.
Mm-hmm.
It was $25.
Come down to earth.
3 pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Did you like yours?
right? I think, I went to the other kitchen, they were closed.
Well, and I think their fish and chips are fresher.
What? Yeah.
And Mayor Moore, just letting you know you're still live in the open session meeting.
It's, or,
Close on.
both off. not the best, but
Thank you.
it is what it is.
Mayor Moore, just letting you know you're still live in the open session meeting.
Thank you so much. Let me, I had to change out my hearing device because the batteries died. So let me open that back up.
Look how quick we all found our way back here.
We're a motivated group.
Oh, we're just getting good at going back and forth.
Yeah, I think that last part's true, but that first part really sounded right too.
We're honing our skills.
My video has been stopped by the host. Must have been something I said.
Wow.
But if you can hear me, we have nothing to report out of closed session, and it is 9:28, so we will adjourn the meeting at 9:28, and hopefully we'll see you guys on Thursday, and otherwise have a great evening and take care.
And see some of you in the parade on Saturday.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See you Thursday.
Okay.
Good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.